How was your boring meeting interrupted in a completely unexpected way? We were in our weekly meeting and heard a huge boom, similar to thunder but louder and longer. Everyone ran to the window, and the car detailing shop next to us was in flames and pieces of the building were strewn about everywhere. They evacuated our building and I got the afternoon off, and miraculously, no one had died. We were having a meeting about a piece of process equipment and how we should replace it soon before it fails. Around that moment, an engineer walked in and announced that the piece of equipment in question had just failed. I caused the interruption. My dad used to be a pastor at a church when I was much younger. One night they were having a meeting about how it was important for the church to have liability insurance, particularly if someone were to get hurt on the church's property. My older brother and I were playing in the children's area with my mum when this was happening. Somehow I ended up falling onto a doorframe and splitting my forehead open. My mother runs into the meeting with me while I had blood all over my face. All the elders and my dad start freaking out and we ended up going to the hospital. The church brought insurance the next day. In short, I became an object lesson on why insurance is important. We were having an all-hands meeting a couple of years ago and several people, as always, had dialed in on the phone. They ask everyone to mute themselves, of course, but someone always forgets. In the middle of our director addressing all of us, we suddenly heard a car horn on the phone, followed by, "Stay in your fricking lane." The director just stopped, laughed, and then said, "As a reminder, it's strictly against policy for any employee to use their phone while driving a car." One of the engineers was napping in the closet in the conference room and walked out of the closet mid-meeting. We were all pretty surprised. I hope that the individual in question followed the rules of comedy, straightened his tie, nodded seriously and greeting, and walked out without explaining himself further. Years ago, I was in a conference call with all of our branch offices. Maybe 14 people in the room and another dozen or so on the call. The co-owner was giving some talk, and right as he pauses, we hear over the conference speaker, "Jesus, this frickin' meeting is bullcrap." The co-owner is a very imposing gentleman, and you could tell his blood was boiling. "Who the frick said that?" he screams. There's a dead silence in the room. "Who the frick said that?" he repeats. Again, dead silence in the room and on the conference call. He eventually calmed down, even though no one admitted to the gaffe. We think one of our technicians simply forgot to mute his mic, but we were never able to figure out who it was. For the record, the meeting was actually fricking bullcrap. We were in the middle of a presentation to an important client, and my coworker, who was doing most of the talking, had a pen burst in his front shirt pocket. Now, this wasn't a huge leak, but it was a light-colored shirt and everyone noticed, so he excused himself to take care of it. Anyway, we carried on in his absence and he came back not more than 5 minutes later and sat down. I turned to look at him and the small blob of ink had since been replaced by a huge, washed-out stain covering about half of his chest. It was impossible not to notice, but we all did our best to keep it together and not laugh. That is, until someone says, "We can kinda see your nips in there, man." It was a government video conference call meeting. Coffee, tea, and snacks had been provided on a small table. A lady got up to get something and started screaming that the cup was filled with hundreds of baby spiders. A woman in tactical purchasing answered her phone, which was on full volume, mid-meeting with 2 vice presidents, 3 facility managers, and 3 department heads present. She didn't leave the room and proceeded to discuss her child's mental health issues and current prescriptions for like 15 minutes. No one had the heart to interrupt her, so we just sort of postponed the meeting until she finally hung up. Half the room had left by that point, extremely frickin' awkward. In a corporate training, and my assistant manager let out a huge as he fell backwards in his chair and crashed through a closet door. He had fallen asleep. Healthy-looking middle-aged lady died mid-meeting. Just slumped over, supposedly caused by a brain aneurysm. Really drives home the pointlessness of it all. Once I was walking down the hallway, tossing raisins into my mouth for a quick snack, and one bounced off my lip, across the floor and into an office where people were having a meeting. I knew they saw it bounce through the door because it was a big raisin and they stopped talking, but they couldn't see me yet as I hadn't walked by the doorway. My office was past their door, so I knew they'd see me eventually as I walked by to get to mine. So I had to make a choice. 1, retrieve the raisin and admit my mistake, or 2, pretend the raisin didn't come from me and walk past, potentially become known as Raisin Boy behind my back. I chose to retrieve the raisin and apologize, but it turns out they didn't even see it bounce in, so to them I just kind of wandered into the room, picked up a raisin off the ground, apologized, and left. I felt like I was in Seinfeld. In short, interrupted a meeting to retrieve my runaway raisin. I was in an interview for an internship after my junior year of college. It was kind of one of those interviews that was less, what are your credentials, and more, when can you start? Knowing this, I was feeling pretty confident and really not too nervous about it. This changed, though, when my interviewer began glancing around and shifting uncomfortably. He was a pretty big guy, so every slight readjustment in his chair was fairly noticeable. It seemed like there was something I'd said or done that had suddenly made him visibly distressed. As if everything was going well, but then I just offhandedly made a grossly inappropriate comment, like a race joke or something. Like I'd just said something that was wildly out of line and just blown right past it. I wondered what it was. I honestly couldn't think of anything. Maybe I was a little too friendly with him. Could that be perceived as being somewhat unprofessional? The interview went on for 5 more minutes as I sat there and thought about what I could have possibly done, and tried my best not to do it again. Rather abruptly, in the middle of my speaking, my interviewer stood up and promptly went number 2. He made brown in his suit. It was a stunning moment. It seemed like he might have suddenly realized that he was dealing with a very, very time-sensitive situation and was frantically trying to get somewhere. But it seems that the basic motor functions of standing up so quickly just forced it all out. It all happened very quick, to be honest. One moment I was explaining how my time as a summer camp counselor had taught me valuable leadership skills, and half a second later my interviewer was on his feet, standing in his own fecal matter. The drastic shift in tone left me completely speechless. Shocked and speechless, I literally didn't know how to respond to the situation. My mock interviews in college had seemingly skipped over this particular instance. All things considered, he handled it okay, I guess. He turned to his office mate and asked her to complete the interview. Oh, and did I mention that he shared an office with an elderly accounting lady, who was an eyewitness to the entire ordeal as well? So, long story short, she finished the interview and I got the job. You know what? Props to them for not being so image-obsessed that they denied a good candidate just for the sake of saving face. These things happen. I've never had a public code brown before, but I hope that when it inevitably happens to me, my onlookers will be as kind and understanding as possible. No shame on that guy. Where I used to work, we had a 9 a.m. PT Wednesday morning meeting. It was that early because half of the team was in California, half was scattered around the East Coast, and one person was in Belgium. So it was early for the West Coast so that it wouldn't be too late for the one guy in frickin' Belgium. The main company office was in California. This was a mid-sized startup with the usual startup culture, so most of the people got in around 10:30. Usually, the office was pretty empty for our meeting. I was one of the remote attendees. About 9:45, the CFO interrupts the meeting and awkwardly asks 4 of the 7 people to come with him. Weird. Then a minute later, he comes back to the remaining 3. He starts by apologizing and saying they were supposed to grab them when they came in, but they were the first ones in. He also apologized that he was about to tell them this as a group, but he wanted to lay it out. Those 3 had been laid off. Why do I know this? Because in the room they had a shared document pulled up on the screen instead of a teleconference. The CFO didn't know they were still broadcasting. Right after the CFO mentioned the layoffs, our Belgium attendee asked, "So, I'm guessing we should leave." I immediately signed off when he said that so that they wouldn't see that I'd waited that long. One of my employees was dialing in from home and hadn't muted his phone. You could hear his dog occasionally barking in the background. A couple of people chimed in, "Well, Rex clearly agrees with that decision," and he didn't get the hint. Then one of his kids started banging pots and pans together and he finally realized he should mute. We're a pretty relaxed bunch and it was an internal call, like no clients on the line, so it was an okay time for him to learn that lesson. I worked at a law firm that was doing a meeting of the senior attorneys and their associates. Some of the senior attorneys were traveling and had to conference in. Here's how that went. "Okay, it looks like we're missing Jim. Can someone get him on the phone? I think I remember his number. I'll call him on my cell." The sound of numbers dialing. "Hello, is this Jim? This is Roger calling about the meeting." "No, this is Dave. Who the hell is Jim?" "Oh, sorry. Looks like I have the wrong number." "Yep, looks like it." The sound of hanging up. Maybe I misdialed. Let me try again." The sound of another number dialing. "Hey Jim, this is Hey, frick you, Roger. I already told you my name's Dave." Click. Our inconvenient meeting-killing statement was short, sweet, and to the point. It was as follows. A plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. When I worked at Taco Bell, we were having a quarterly staff meeting to talk about general issues and staff changes, as well as new items coming out. Like an extra-large chalupa, if I remember correctly. This meeting was happening at 7 a.m. to avoid having to deal with customers being in the lobby as well. A lot of people were annoyed, but I didn't mind because I was getting paid and I got to try the new chalupa. Anyways, halfway through, one of the manager's water broke. She, like all of us, was unaware that she was pregnant. We all just thought she was fat. So, needless to say, she missed her first shift that night and I ended up covering it. Still, a pretty good meeting because of the above-mentioned free chalupa. Glad that I didn't have to mop that morning. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. We had one day like that. There was a mass layoff for our tiny little company. A third of my department was let go. They were quietly telling each person individually throughout the morning. At about noon, they called everyone remaining into the large conference room to break the news of what just happened and let us know that everyone not in the room had been let go. Just before the meeting ended, one more person wandered past the door to the conference room, holding their lunch and whistling a happy tune. It turned out that one of the people being let go had already left for lunch when they got to their name on the list and hadn't actually been told yet. It was a whole herd of deer in the headlights there. Never been in a more awkward moment in my life. Again, according to the laws of comedy, I hope that this person saw everyone and laughed before jokingly saying something like, "Hey, what's the matter, guys? You all just get fired? What did I miss, huh?" Two come to mind. The first was an exiting CTO who was leaving under some scandals. I started in the company while he took a month of sick leave after it was discovered that he had bought equipment from our company to use for his personal business. He was apparently a pretty easygoing guy, but as his time started to dwindle, he became more impulsive and irrational. One day, my boss was going over some stuff with us techs about some new procedure. "So, you see, this chart shows how we intend to integrate our—" And the CTO ran into the meeting room Kramer style and drunkenly announced, Anyone who buys a domain in a foreign country needs to see me before they pay with us funds. Not a finger." Then he paused and ran out of the room. "So, this integration will reduce the time needed for cross-department approvals." My boss continued as if nothing had happened. Another one was a CTO having a huge meeting. The meeting room was packed to the walls with dozens more on speakerphone. Sometimes someone dials in, puts the meeting on their speakerphone and forgets to hit mute. And when someone's not paying attention, they don't hear someone screaming to put their call on mute. So you'd hear ka-thumpa-thumpa on the keyboard and ring of their private message client at full volume. But you couldn't call anyone out because you didn't know who was doing this out of the dozens that called in. This meeting, it was real bad. The CTO started talking about possible downsizing. Some idiot was on the phone, ka-thumpa-thumpa-thumpa-thumpa-thump of a keyboard, bring, ka-thumpa-thumpa-thumpa, bring, bring. "Can the people on speakerphone hit their mute buttons?" screamed the CTO. Ka-thumpa-thumpa, bring. Then we heard a cell phone ring. "Hello? Yeah, hi Tom. Oh, nothing. What's up?" So we heard this guy talk to his friend about a new BMW he bought and how he Jewed the salesperson down for a deal. The CTO was Jewish, and now real mad. He hung up on the call after telling anyone to listen to call back in. Later, he grilled departments to see who recently brought a new car. Quickly, the BMW owner was located in a distant office 20 miles away. He was banned from using a speakerphone and had to drive in for every meeting and report in person. I was once in a private meeting discussing whether to hire an applicant. Someone realized they left a sheet of paper at their desk, got up and opened the door to go get it. As soon as the door was open, an uninvited manager fell through the doorway. He'd been right outside, pressing his ear against the door to listen in. In the middle of a meeting last year, the lady speaking passed out and hit the floor, microphone still in hand. We helped her up. After 10 minutes, she resumed speaking and blacked out again. We helped her up. She continues to finish the meeting while laying on the floor. What the frick meeting was so important that you had to do that? "If I die here, I just wanted you all to know. Congratulations to Jim, your employee of the month." Ugh. I was at a job interview and the interviewer had to go because Mike Pence randomly showed up in the building. I'm going to have to say it was the time that the general manager of my resort shot a rubber band across the room and it hit the wedding coordinator right between the eyes. It made for a very interesting staff meeting afterwards. I was alone in my office on a conference when over the intercom a polite female voice said, and I'll never forget these words, "Attention all staff. Armed intruders have gained access to the building." I remember thinking, this has got to be a drill, but it was at a weird time for a drill, shortly after 1 p.m. when many people were still at lunch. So I took it seriously and hung up the phone, locked my door, grabbed some scissors. Look, I know, but Christ, I had to have something. My friends really laughed at me for that, jerks. And I hid in the corner behind a big cabinet. It was eerily quiet for the next 10 to 15 minutes. I texted some friends who I knew were still out to lunch to not come back to the office. Eventually, another 10 to 15 minutes later, another announcement was made that there was no threat and the building was safe. It turned out that the security staff were updating the emergency announcements, and one of the guys, I joke you not, bumped the armed intruder announcement. Whoops! Well, thankfully it was a false alarm. It was not a small event. Some people were truly terrified. A couple of people collapsed and had to be taken to hospital. My favorite of the whole thing was that it was a lockdown strategy. Our building, it turns out, has automated steel doors that would slam shut and protect anyone in the wings until the cops cleared the building. Assuming, you're not trapped inside there with a fricking dude with an AK, so it wasn't an evacuation strategy. That said, there were numerous stories of our vice presidents running out of the building like goddamn George Costanza. So much for leadership. In follow-up meetings, the security team stressed that since there are only a few obvious points of exit from the building, they make for perfect kill zones, so, don't do what the bosses did. I was at a school board meeting once for work. The board is moving through the agenda in the typical boring way when some woman got up and started screaming about how she had no kids and should not have to pay school tax. One of the board members was trying to tell her that the high-rated public schools increased her home value. But nope, she just kept screaming at the top of her lungs until the super old security guard walked over and told her to leave or he'd have to call the local cops. The old libertarians causing problems again, I see. I hear about these weirdos in every public assembly, citizens meeting, and often see them in opinion pieces or letters to the editor. You morons benefit from these taxes, directly or indirectly, the same way as this woman does. Just pay your due and get a better hobby than screaming in public for attention. You're just bored. I was pretty new to the company and was at my third or fourth department meeting. There was another manager there, a very attractive woman my age. Well, she sits down at this meeting in a rush. She was the very last to arrive. She was carrying a bottle of seltzer water with her to drink. She opens the seltzer and it explodes all over the entire conference table, soaking all of us. I laughed, she laughed, some others laughed, and some didn't. I'll never forget it. I asked her out about 2 months afterwards. Now our daughter is a junior in high school. In high school, I'd joined a Boy Scouts Explorers post at the local newspaper. A reporter had started up the group with the BSA and was teaching a bunch of high schoolers how to be reporters. We met at the paper weekly, and the paper gave us a page periodically that we were able to fill with whatever content we wanted, within obvious reason and generally accepted newspaper standards. I was at the weekly meeting, and the topic that week was press conferences, specifically how to ask what kinds of questions to get whatever information you need to get. So the reporter had dressed up as a baseball player and was giving a press conference for being the first woman to be signed to a Major League Baseball team. We were firing off questions and she was answering, and all was going pretty well. With zero warning, of course, a bearded guy busted into the room screaming at her about something she had done to annoy him. He grabbed her and took her out of the room. So all we could do was hear him yelling and screaming, and we were all frozen 15 and 16-year-olds wondering what the frick to do. Finally, they came back into the room laughing. It was all a setup to teach us about our observational skills. What did the guy look like? What was he wearing? What was he yelling about? Etc. That was a powerful lesson as a young reporter because we learned that even when 20 people witness the same event, there'll be 20 different opinions about what just happened. So you have to ask a lot of people the same questions to start to pull together an accurate picture of what had gone down. This was back in the 80s, and no way in heck would such a thing fly now. Parents would lose their damn minds, but I will never forget that meeting. In a meeting with pastries, one coworker says, "Oh, donuts." Another one pipes in, "Don't take the cream-filled one, it's the boss's favorite." The coworker takes the cream-filled donut, takes a bite, and smiles directly at the boss. The boss walked over, reached across the boardroom table, grabs the donut, mushes it in the provocateur's face, sits down, and resumes the meeting. Oh, it was me. I was the interruption. I had a crappy boss that loved meetings. In one of them, her and this other guy got into a discussion, and after about 15 minutes I said, "Can I leave? This has nothing to do with me and I have work to do." The other 20 people in the room thanked me privately and said they couldn't believe I didn't get fired. Not my meeting, and memorable, but not in a good way. I worked at a small company, just 3 people. I answered the phone one random afternoon, and the caller, someone I was familiar with, asked for my boss. I said the usual line about being in a meeting and can I take a message. He said, "Interrupt him now, please." The caller was not prone to drama, so I suspected it was important and got my boss. He was calling to tell us a photographer we'd worked with was killed, alongside another photographer while working in Libya. That was one of the most surreal days of my working life. Worked at a dog-friendly office and we had an all-staff meeting, so about 20 people and probably about 8 dogs. HR was in the middle of a presentation when a 30-pound dog, A corgi mix, so long and skinny with short legs, jumped up in an office desk chair sitting up by itself towards the front, and it starts spinning, and spinning, and spinning. It spun for over a minute and everyone was just losing it. The dog's face said, "F this." I've never laughed so hard in a meeting in my life. We had a board meeting at a church where they also hold various other meetings. My friend walked into AA with a six-pack of beer thinking it was our board meeting. I was working for a popular restaurant in high school. There was a meeting at 8 a.m. on the first Saturday of the month. The only person absent was the head chef, a guy, and the line cook, a woman, both of whom had closed the night before. They walked in together halfway through the meeting looking like they just woke up. The line cook had a rubber stuck to her shoe. Everyone knew exactly what went on last night. Have you ever interviewed someone and wondered, what is wrong with you? I once had a candidate for an intermediate-level analyst job brag during an interview that he used to work other jobs and play poker, while working his primary office job. For example, for about 2 weeks before he was caught and got fired from all his jobs, he'd take long lunches. No one knew where he went between 10:30 and 1:30. Turns out he'd gotten a job making pizzas at the next-door pizza restaurant and worked the lunch rush. He also bragged about playing poker at work constantly. This was in the late 2000s while online poker was still in its big boom. He bragged about these things to me as if I, a relatively young professional at the time, would think he was cool. Or maybe he thought it demonstrated his ability to multitask and still get his job done. I have no idea. Either way, we did not extend him an offer. Had a candidate come in who said how hot my admin was and asked if she was single or open to Freaky Fridays. What, switching bodies with our teenage daughter to learn a lesson about considering others' points of view and importance of family? No, but the implications were definitely regarding bodies and swapping something. During the interview I asked, "I see you've managed a vegetarian restaurant." "What?" "It says here you managed a vegetarian restaurant on your CV." "Oh, I guess I did write that. Not really though. My girlfriend had an art exhibition and I organized the sandwiches for the opening. They were vegetarian." This was a candidate that was otherwise pretty impressive seeming, and he had been among the favorite candidates for a sought-after position. The interview had gone quite well up until this point. I met him later at a party. He had no memory of me. "Oh no, it was more of a catering firm. I meant to change that. I had someone helping me with my resume and we just put that as a placeholder. But apparently I forgot to change that. I apologize. In fact, it was just me and my girlfriend who started a small catering business and we did a few jobs, but we realized we couldn't live off the profits and decided to put that idea on the shelf, and here I am now." You see, you've just got to spin these things quicker. Reading replies like the one you've just finished hearing makes me realize that fluent bullcrap really is such a vital interview skill. That's probably why so many other work horror stories we read about seem to get such a wealth of crazy and unqualified people in them. Presumably people who've lied and inflated their small activities into impressive achievements on their CV and talked them up in the interview. This kid, probably 18 to 20, just started picking his nose, like knuckle deep and digging for gold in the middle of his food service job interview. I wrapped that up real quick and didn't hire him. I interviewed a girl once, and while we were talking, I was looking over her resume. Please note that English is her first language, or else this wouldn't have humored me so much. Her mission statement on her resume was as follows: "Along with my detail-oriented and organizational skills, I will encourage team to work cooperatively and creativity to provide and understanding the visual aspects of our work." This was for an admin position at a law firm. Not sure what the visual aspects of our work entailed in this position, honestly. I read that over about 5 or 6 times, worried that I was having a stroke, so I didn't really hear much of anything else she said during the interview. I haven't been able to make sense of it no matter how many times I read it. I actually cut it out of her resume and have it sitting on my desk some 15 years later. In short, she was a lazy liar. Hiring a business intelligence analyst? There are a great variety of ways to get into this profession. I'm open to many of them. Frankly, if you have a good head on your shoulders and know even basic SQL, I can probably work with you, though lately I've had to get more picky as our projects have become more complex. This woman is mid-40s, boisterous personality, and seems like she'd be a good organizational fit. The problem is, she keeps lying, but only halfway. So, do you know SQL? Oh yes, I have years of experience with it. Great, so take a look at this code. This is the sort of thing we need to do. What's this? For some reason though, the most egregious lie that stands out in my head with her was when she commented, when I suggested she not take a particular route to the train station because it was dark and potentially unsafe. Also, I was headed to the same station and did not wish to commute with her. She said that she had a black belt and practiced martial arts for years. Oh cool, what discipline? I don't remember. For frick's sake. We had a shortlisted candidate come up for a campus interview. This usually includes a meeting with the dean, a long interview with the full hiring committee, a formal meeting with the department chair, dinner with the hiring committee, a formal job talk, a 1-hour academic lecture, teaching a simple undergrad course and meeting some students, as well as a campus tour. During the job talk, he kept flashing the pink satin liner of his suit jacket in the direction of one of our openly gay grad students. Everyone noticed. Later, he proceeded to get trashed during the meet and greet with the students at a local bar and confided all of the dirt about his current department and overshared the status of his rocky relationship with a grad student back in his home university, which was a big no-no even though it happens sometimes. The next morning sealed the big fat no. A grad student usually volunteers and is compensated to drive the candidate back to the airport. This person kept trying to persuade the openly gay grad student to drive him instead, even though another student, female, already had the task assigned to her. You know, this guy didn't get an offer. I'll never understand being so confident about this kind of thing that you would go into a really important recruiting situation and behave like this. Honestly, if I'm ever flown out of somewhere for any kind of work, be it interview or otherwise, that's me on high alert and vigilant for the entire journey, apart from maybe weekends. You just can't risk something like that. And yes, it's exhausting. When she listed all of her ex-boyfriends that currently worked there and said she couldn't wait to see the looks on their faces when she showed up to work. This was in the first 3 minutes of the interview, so I wasn't even close to offering her the job yet. I cut the interview right there and sent her on her way. You didn't invite her back for a second interview by a panel of her ex-boyfriends? How did you resist? Honestly, the thought crossed my mind, and in that office it would have been widely appreciated. I set up an interview for an acquaintance's nephew, with the company looking to hire 30 college students for summer work. The nephew's major and the line of work this company performed seemed to mesh perfectly, and I knew the hiring manager personally, so it seemed like a great fit. A couple of weeks later, the acquaintance emails asking about the job. So I hit up my hiring manager friend and the conversation went something like this. So, how did the round of hiring go? HR said, great, needed to fill 30 spaces and only had to do 31 interviews to fill them. Oh, cool. So was Paul one of them? Oh, him. Yeah. Well, he was undressed during the interview, so we declined. What? Are you serious? I find it hard to believe he'd show up to an interview undressed. Well, it was a Skype interview, and when we brought up his video feed, he was lying in bed in the buck. Well, maybe he thought you couldn't see him? Maybe he thought it was an audio meeting? We told him we could see him, and he said, sorry, and then covered himself up with a sheet. We asked if he wanted to reschedule, and he said no, he was good. So, yeah, we decided to pass. Sorry, Paul. I've had 2 separate cases where people were so confident that they had the job that they botched the interview. On one of these, I wanted to tell the candidate to go out and come back again, because he was one of 2 very good choices and his arrogance put my team off. They thought the other candidate would be a better fit. I've learned this is really important. I beat out a woman for a position who had literally decades of experience on me because no one got along with her. All my coworkers went to our boss and asked her to please not hire the other woman because she's so hard to deal with, even in small doses. They couldn't imagine having her around every day for 8 hours, and our boss listened, I guess, because here I am. I was performing a video interview with a candidate. They were clearly in a large bedroom with most of it visible in the background, but it was clean so I didn't mind. In the back right corner was a closed door. About 7 minutes into the interview, I see the door open slightly and some guy poke his head in, see that his roommate or girlfriend was in an interview and then close the door. Not a big deal, it happens. I asked my next question and let the candidate respond. But then about 30 seconds later, I see the door slowly open again, only this time the guy comes crawling out of the bottom. He continues to crawl across the floor, making his way to the opposite side of the room. I assume he thought he was out of the camera's field of view, but he was clearly visible. He gets to the far end of the room and turns to fiddle with something, butt in the air facing the camera. Finally, he finishes with whatever he was doing and makes his way back and out of the door. I know I should have stopped the candidate and had her deal with the guy, but it was so funny to watch that I had to let it play out. I could barely contain my laughter, and after the interview finished, I lost it. She got the job though, and from what I remember, she was a great employee. Eventually, we did bring it up in the break room. She confessed that she knew what was happening, and she could see the guy on her camera. She was so mortified and embarrassed but wasn't sure how to react in the moment, so she just ignored it and answered the question. I told her it was one of the most hilarious things I'd seen in an interview. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Hiring for a customer support role. Explained to the candidate on pre-interview email how she'd need to sign in at our reception kiosk and register herself, get a name tag sorted, and then the hiring manager, me, would be informed and would come out to the lobby to get her. 15 minutes before interview time, I hear a god almighty jangly noise and see a woman repeatedly trying to open the locked door, and at one point uses her hands to beat the door and wave at people inside, and find out she's the candidate we're meant to interview and she never read the instructions. She lost out on the role there and then, but we still met her for about 10 minutes. We interviewed 3 other people that day and none had problems with interview etiquette. The strangest ever was a man telling us all about his mum's Alzheimer's, talking crap about our company, and getting upset we didn't offer him the position on the spot. It was a wild ride beginning to end. I had someone show up in Daisy Dukes and cowboy boots for an office job at a 4-star hotel. The narrator has now looked up what Daisy Dukes are, and yes, I can now understand that showing up to a fancy hotel interview in a tied-up crop top and denim short shorts may not in fact have been what the establishment was looking for. The people at my last teaching job interview said more or less the same thing, funnily enough. We were looking for a sous chef that would be able to work and train for a few months and then eventually fill my shoes as CDC, as I was leaving in about 6 months' time. We were a big, very successful restaurant in a super competitive city, and had a ton of applications and interviews. Most interviews for a chef position include a pretty informal chat with a hiring chef, the owner and the general manager, and a cooking and tasting portion, where the interviewee plans a meal of 5 or 6 dishes and serves them to the interviewers. One guy came in and killed the interview, and served incredible dish after incredible dish, but the owner didn't like him because the guy interviewing was tattoo-less and more than 50 years old, and he felt that this guy's age wasn't conducive to our hip, late-night vibe. Whatever, you do you, Jeff, you insufferable prick. The same owner calls me a few days later and tells me that he's found a guy that he wanted to poach from a small bistro just outside our town. The guy comes in and is super cool, fresh jacket, oozes confidence, and a ton of cooking tattoos. The owner is in love, and I'm hoping that this new guy is into overweight dudes with chef jackets that are 2 sizes too small. Before the interview, all candidates had to send over an ingredients list so that we could order any ingredients that they may need for the cooking portion of the interview. And this guy had requested some foie gras for a dish he said had been awarded time and again, a foie and lobster crepe. Didn't sound very good to me, but I was willing to give it a shot and see how it went. After the meeting, the guy went into our kitchen and started cooking. After about 10 minutes, we all hear the guy screaming at one of our prep cooks to slice him some chives. A few minutes after that, he brings out the app, which he says is his take on shrimp and grits, something that is already on our menu and that he says is better than ours. I point out a few things. The shrimp is overcooked, the grits are gluey, and the chives he was so stressed about weren't even on the plate. He tells me that the problem was that our prep cook didn't speak English, and that when he was chef, he'd make sure the entire back-of-house staff was fluent. Holy crap, warning bell number 1. After 2 more dismal dishes, he tells us that he's going to make his famous crepes. I'm freaking pumped because I know that it's going to be an absolute crap show. The guy is in the kitchen for at least 45 minutes, screaming, cursing, and throwing crap around. I go back into the kitchen to see what the guy is doing, and he's fiddling with the Vitamix, which looks like it's full of cork. I ask him what's going on, and he tells me he's just blending the crepe batter. I point out that crepe batter usually doesn't have the consistency of modeling clay, and he pretty much tells me to F off, and that this dish has won awards. I look over at his phone, which is out on the table, and see that there is a recipe from allrecipes.com for crepes pulled up. So not only does this guy not know how to make his signature dish, but he can't even follow a simple fricking recipe. He brings his dish out, and it's a fricking mess. Burned foie, rubbery lobster, broken béarnaise. The concept sucked, but the execution was somehow even worse. The crepe itself, though, was a culinary abomination. It was as if someone had given a lump of grey Play-Doh a pap smear. I straight up told him this was one of the worst things I'd seen produced in a kitchen, and he pushed back, saying that it would have been great if my staff had given him the support he needed. Despite my protests, we actually hired this guy. The owner thought that he was cool and projected the kind of image we needed. He lasted about a month before I threw his butt out of my kitchen, which the owner never forgave me for. I called the old guy that killed the interview and offered him the job, and he essentially told me to get bent, because he knew he deserved the job in the first place, and he was right. To start the interview, I asked him to tell us, 3 people, a little bit about himself. 35 minutes later, he stopped talking. Usually people answer this question in 1 to 5 minutes. It was incredibly awkward and I was tempted to interrupt him, but then truly wanted to see how long he'd go on. We have a very simple pre-employment test. If you've been in our industry for more than a year, you should get 100%. Sometimes we even give it as a take-home test. We had one guy that took his test home and had it for over a week. He brought it to the formal interview and got 90% of the questions wrong, even though according to his resume he was an all-star and knew everything. He had an excuse for every wrong answer to even the most widely known questions in our industry. It would be the equivalent of saying you'd been laying sod for 20 years and then put the green side down. He didn't get the job. I did a phone interview with the guy and he seemed really excited and very friendly. He seemed to be relatively new to the field, but we were willing to give him a chance. I invited him to come in for an in-person interview. My manager and I were doing this second interview, and when I called him in, he gave me a huge hug and proceeded to talk to me like I was his best friend. As a 27-year-old woman, I was incredibly uncomfortable and froze up. At the end of the interview, we told him we'd reach out to him within a couple of weeks to let him know the outcome. After the interview, my manager asked if I knew him, and I said definitely I did not. His interview was not great either, and he was not a good fit for the job. He proceeded to call my phone every day that week and left me long voicemails. Most of the times he'd ask about his interview, but sometimes he'd say things like, "Hey girl, how are things going? I was thinking if I get hired, we should hang out." It freaked me out, and I had my manager call him early to give him the news that he didn't get the job. The calls didn't stop, and I just kept deleting his voicemails without listening. My manager and I were so disturbed by his persistence that we went to HR for help, and they must have done something because the calls stopped after that. Yuck, that's a boundary problem in every sense of the word and an office creep just waiting to happen. It's an impressive enough problem that HR had to get involved with a party that didn't even technically work there. I was the interviewee. I wasn't feeling well that morning, but I had an interview with a super cool science museum as a promotions event coordinator. It would have been the perfect job. I decided to go to the interview anyway. As I drove to the interview, I felt horrible. When I went inside, I was feeling worse. I was asked to sit and wait for the hiring manager to come and get me. When she finally did, I knew I'd made a mistake in coming in. I got up and followed her across the whole museum up 2 flights of stairs. It felt like it was 120 degrees in there. And finally, as we were walking toward her office and she reached for the door handle, my stomach let go. I barely made it to the trash can right next to me and proceeded to hurl for a good 2 minutes, even dry heaving a few times. When I was finished, I looked up and she had her back to me with her head in her hands, like she was trying to hold it together. I said I was sorry and I hoped she had a better day than me, and I turned around and left. Man, that would have been a fun job. Hiring for an apartment building doorman. He kept telling me that he was just on the phone with Hong Kong putting together a currency exchange transaction and that he was working on another big thing in China. He asked me to wait a few minutes while he finished typing an email, told me that he was always on the phone. We didn't hire him. I have 2 stories. The first is back in college days. We were interviewing for a new college newspaper reporter. The question was, this position requires an energetic, inquisitive, outgoing person who can chase a story and get the facts. With that in mind, how would you describe yourself? The answer was, fun? Do you care to elaborate on that? No. They didn't get the position. The second story was someone applying for an IT position in my later career. An individual that had been fired from one branch of a government agency decided to apply for another branch a few years later. But his resume read very much differently than the reality. Instead of him being fired for essentially not knowing how to do his primary job function, he was now let go when the project closed, 3 years after he was fired. Also, all of his resume achievements listed for that time were things either myself or one of my co-workers had accomplished, things that he didn't even have any involvement with. I guess he didn't realize we were on the hiring panel because we'd merged with another region. I honestly don't fathom how he thought that was going to work out, because it was the same agency and it's not like we wouldn't have noticed. She cried 3 times during the interview about how much she hated her current job. My coworker had to get up and grab a box of tissues for her. When she finally calmed down, she informed us that she'll need a special desk chair due to an injury she sustained at her current job. And yes, she did have a workers' compensation court case against said job, and she hoped to win big. No one had said anything about hiring her, she just made an assumption that she got the job, I guess. The icing on the cake was that she was interviewing for a workers' compensation job at a firm where we only represent employers, never injured people. While that doesn't influence hiring decisions, talking at length about her current case against her boss was a weird thing to bring up. That and crying. I'm pretty well acquainted with employment and comp law. She didn't get turned down because she had a comp case. Crying 3 times, believe it or not, did the trick of taking her off the callback list. I felt really bad for her, but dude, you can't do that in an interview. I hire student university workers. One of my questions is, tell me about a time at work where you made a mistake and how you fixed it. This kid had no prior work experience, so I modified the question to remove the at work part. I thought he'd tell me about messing up at school or at home. Nope. He told me about the time where he'd ripped his pants in gym class in the 4th grade. He didn't tell me how he fixed the situation either, so I'm assuming his pants are ripped to this day. This kid was a goldmine of what not to do in an interview, to be honest. He didn't get the job. What stupid self-inflicted injuries have you seen that could have been easily avoided? I was a firefighter and we were called to a vehicle fire at midnight in a rural area. We get there and sure enough there's a pickup truck fully engulfed in flames. This wasn't the usual engine compartment fire. The whole truck was roaring. I was the nozzle man at the time on my engine, which meant my job was to be the guy spraying water on the fire. As I got closer to the pickup, I noticed a gosh-awful smell. I was relatively new, so I couldn't place it, but I just knew it was putrid. My heart immediately sank when I remembered there was a missing girl case in our area. People often stash evidence inside cars and then burn the whole thing to get rid of the evidence. Guns, clothes, even bodies. As I'm putting out the fire, I'm dreading what I'll find. Something was in the truck bed. The fact that the truck's owner wasn't on the scene made me more nervous. Fast forward and the fire's out. Turns out the truck bed was filled with a dozen pumpkins. Thankfully, no bodies. But we had no idea where the driver was. A few days later, we heard from the cops that just before we showed up at the fire, a lone guy arrived at the ER with massive, full-body burns. Turns out that as this guy was driving his pumpkins to a nearby farmer's market, he hit something in the road. His gas gauge went to empty and he smelled gas coming from his truck. The hero of this story crawled under his truck to assess the damage and used the only light source he had, a Bic lighter. Someone saw the fire and drove him to the ER. Some separate passerby was the one who actually called in the fire. In short, if you think you have a gas leak, don't use your lighter as your light source. Can't decide, so I'll take 2. Worst injuries, the bikers who thought going 300 kilometers an hour on the German Autobahn was a good idea because it's legal. Those ones are too far gone to even be organ donors, at least for the larger parts. The stupidest, the guy who climbed a fence to sneak into an open-air concert. His engagement ring got caught on the top of the chain-link fence when he jumped down, which degloved his finger and part of his hand. It was past 10 p.m., so the gates were open and entrance was free. Pedestrian versus train is always like a bomb went off. My colleague found an enucleated eyeball like half a mile down the track from the majority of the body. Apparently, it was her screensaver for a few years at work. The narrator can't really put his finger on why someone having a photo they took of an eyeball seems so much more sick and twisted a screensaver than, say, a picture that they'd found on Google, which honestly just seems kind of quirky. I guess it's the fact that you know the full tragic story and decided to go, "Okay, I want this on my screen," that seems so morbid. People are weird. Some guy decided kicking a running mower blade that was jammed up was a great idea. He was nice enough to bring his foot in to us, though, in a cooler full of beer. My boss's husband was mowing the lawn and then the blades jammed. Decided to unclog it with his bare hand. He only lost the tips of all his fingers. Too much work to turn it off. Besides, I can just get it out real quick and— oh my god, my hand! There was an SUV full of teenagers driving down the highway in busy traffic. They were driving pretty aggressively. They tried to pass a truck, but the truck is towing a trailer and can't slow down quickly enough to let them pass before oncoming traffic gets close. So they slow down and try to make a second pass. The 15-year-old in the back seat decides to pull his pants down and hang his butt out and moon the other car. Once they passed, they overcorrected and rolled. The kid doing the mooning was ejected and left half his brains and his left arm in a 75-foot line down the middle of the highway. I work in a hospital. There's a lot of stupid crap I've seen. Climbing things and falling off them is a big one. And skateboarding without helmets. I know helmets look embarrassing when skateboarding, but a guy came off his board and was in an induced coma for a week after cracking his head open, for frick's sake. My mom nearly died because he wasn't wearing a helmet while biking. Seeing my dad on his hands and knees, screaming desperately into my mom's ears, trying to wake her up, was the best helmet PSA that 5-year-old me ever got. I met a guy while I was in the hospital ER that was getting out after suffering a stab wound to his leg. I asked him what happened, and he told me that his friend stabbed him with a carving knife. I asked him why he'd do something like that, and he replied, "We were both drunk and decided to see if I could feel it." At least he had a sense of humor about it. My dad is a police officer, and in the first few weeks he was working, he had 2 really bad accident calls. The first one was on a local highway where a guy had lost control of his U-Haul and flipped it. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt and was ejected. He landed, most likely already dead, and the truck came to rest on his head. Only on his head. The other one was more gruesome. A homeless man was sleeping under garbage when a garbage truck drove onto him trying to get closer to the dumpster. I know this has been said many times, I think even in Deadpool, but he described it as if you ran over a tube of toothpaste. The top popped and the bottom was completely flat. My cousin is an EMT, and he said one of the nastiest scenes he came upon was a car accident in which the passenger had both her legs up on the dash. Airbags deployed, causing severe fractures on both of her ankles, and pushed her knees into her face, breaking her eye socket. He said she was fully conscious when he arrived and in incredible pain. If I remember correctly, she survived and was expected to make a full recovery. He has lots of crazy stories, mostly crystal and drunk drivers though. 25 years in the fire service. Pick one. A. Dropping your smack pipe onto your bed and burning off all your skin and flesh. B. Getting drunk and hitting a tree sideways with your Grand Cherokee so hard that the frame rails met on the other side. Oh, and not being identified for 4 days because all you had was a fake ID. And C. Stopping your truck on the side of the I-95 to pee at 2 a.m. Getting out on the traffic side and getting waffled by a truck. Seriously, fricking drunk drivers. Nothing beats getting out of bed at 1 a.m., spending 5 hours watching the Staties do their investigation, and then going to work on 2 hours sleep. Here's one from within the last year that I didn't have to deal with directly. Some butthole walked into traffic to self-delete at 5 a.m. on 95 in Greenwich, Connecticut. Got himself flattened, but the trucker didn't notice, and the traffic kept running over him until 9. I went over the smear around 6:30 and noticed the clothes everywhere. 4 hours of the NYC commuter rush drove over that guy's carcass. The smear was spread over 3 lanes and 100 yards. People are used to dead deer and some trash on the road. Plus it was early and very dark. A friend of mine told me about a call he had as an EMT. It was for a guy with an ungloved member in a hot tub. Firefighter here. Teenage boy ducked and rolled from a car traveling about 40 miles per hour because a bee got into the car and he was allergic to bees. Holy crap, this is really one of those, you shouldn't have to be struggling not to laugh when you hear this one, and I'm very, very sorry. I can't fault the kid for taking his chances and grazing the crap out of his skin, but surely at that point you freeze in fear and mutter through gritted teeth for the driver to please slow down so you can run for your life. I'm just saying that going from seated and belted to leaping bodily out of a moving vehicle is something that would run against my instinct, even if my allergy, an axe-wielding psychopath, was in the car. My dad was working on these kinds of things in the 1970s. One of the stories he told me was he was called to an early morning accident on the 101 where a drunk driver got an off-ramp and hit another car head-on. Neither the driver nor the passenger in the right-of-way car were wearing their seatbelts. The driver was impaled on the column of the steering wheel, and the passenger was launched through the windshield and then skid on his head, both dead at the scene. And the drunk driver? Totally fine since he was so drunk he basically went ragdoll on impact. A theater was being renovated. The theater was designed for a specific show, and that show left after something like a 15-year run. One of the design quirks of the theater was a concrete basement underneath the stage, where machinery would push up some pretty impressive set changes from below. This meant that the stage had giant open holes in it after all that machinery and stuff was cleared out of the basement. The holes in the stage opened up to a 30-foot drop with bare concrete beneath. The crew who was tearing down the stuff on the stage took some precautions to make sure nobody fell into these holes. They put plywood over the holes and set up caution cones all around them. When they finished tearing down all the stuff from the stage, the last things remaining were those cones and plywood. Someone picked up all the cones, and it was our future patient's job to pick up the plywood. These were long sheets of plywood, too big just to throw over his shoulder, so he picked up one side of the plywood sheet and started walking forward, pushing it along the stage floor. He never even saw the hole he fell through because the plywood he was pushing blocked his view of his own feet. He fell 30 feet and tumbled on the way down, landing directly only on his outstretched hands. He had multiple nasty compound fractures in both arms. Luckily, the shattering bones of his arms broke a lot of the momentum, so when his head smashed down into the concrete, it wasn't going fast enough to kill him. It knocked him unconscious and knocked out all of his teeth on one side of his head. It also crushed and dislocated his jaw. The radial and ulnar fractures were the worst. His hands just hung limply, with gore everywhere and his bones clearly exposed on both forearms. He woke up while we were prepping him for ambulance transport. He mumbled something to us, but his speech was garbled and messed, mostly due to his injury, but also due to the spinal immobilization we put on him, which tucks underneath the chin. He kept mumbling, After a while, I realized he was trying to tell us that his hands hurt. Which makes sense, considering the circumstances. He fell 30 feet onto concrete. He was damn lucky just to have survived. EMS supervisor of a well-known party campus. Of all the calls with completely blotto patients, the winner is a freshman who drank one beer and attempted to slide down the railing of his fourth-floor dorm's stairwell, only to fall 5 stories upside down onto the concrete basement floor, with only his head as a cushion. On arrival, the pool of blood, twice his size, gave me no hope when I reached down to check his pulse. To my surprise, he not only survived his ICU hospitalization, he sat next to me on the first day of organic chemistry a year later. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Thankfully, I didn't see it as our response was over the phone, but we got a call from a car that had done a rollover and no one was responding, so we got police out there ASAP. At some point, a bystander came to the car and said there was no one outside, which is weird because someone had to have been there at some point for it to crash, right? Well, about 10 minutes later, the bystander came back to say he'd found the driver, or at least half of him. We had to call the police back and let them know the driver was bisected at the waist. Later on, the bystander reported he found the torso as well. Bad day to be a good Samaritan for him, I think. Some of the other people in the office were speculating it was a murder cover-up, but he probably just didn't have his seatbelt on. If your car rolls over and half of you is flying out the window, that's something that happens. I was actually just thinking of this the other day. I know a family in my small town that recently lost their son in a car accident. The son and his girlfriend were just driving around late at night on the roads around their farm, and they've driven on them hundreds of times. They got talking or something after he missed a turn, having to swerve and tipping his truck over. He wasn't wearing his seatbelt, so he was thrown out of the window and smashed by the truck, killing him instantly. His girlfriend was wearing her seatbelt and didn't even have a scratch on her. The truck itself was totally drivable. It was kind of dented on the side that it was landed on, but a little buffing out and you wouldn't even know his car was in an accident. But he was killed. Moral of the story, wear your seatbelt. A lesson that the narrator has had thoroughly drilled into him after doing a bunch of these medical videos, and hopefully one that the rest of you will take to heart as well. That and doing any of the other things in these stories. My days of getting tipsy and climbing on things may be done. Responded to a young guy that fell out of the shower when he slipped. He impaled a wooden toilet plunger into the side of his chest underneath his armpit. It was literally halfway down the wood into his body. The guy was standing in the living room when we got there, plunger and all. How he was alive, I don't know. Our mouths were open after going into the home, had to put him sideways on the stretcher in a position of comfort. The poor guy had just been showering. I was skimming and I saw shower, slipped, and toilet plunger and was expecting it to have gone up his butt accidentally. But this was much worse than a colon puncture. I was at work, sitting there with my boss. This guy comes running into our office and cries for help, talking about his friend standing outside. We walk out and see another young man holding his hand, covered in blood and missing 1.5 fingers. We of course help him, having a first aid kit and luckily my boss being well taught in first aid. He then got transported by helicopter. But the interesting thing is how he got the injury. Apparently, the guys were having a barbecue and took a circular saw to cut open their buns. I did this so often before, it never went wrong. I later learned they were able to save at least one of his fingers. The worst injury I've seen caused by something stupid was a man who crashed into a tree on the side of the highway. He had a nice gouge in his scalp and totaled his car. The reason he did this? He imagined the exit was about half a mile earlier than it was and tried to merge off into the grass. He was also high as frick on whippets. Really strange to find an entire box of NO2 canisters in someone's passenger seat and an empty whipped cream dispenser, which is the stupidest substance I can think of besides huffing paint. I nearly had a similar diversion from the I-75 through Atlanta when someone threw a glass bottle out of their window and it flew into mine and cracked me across the skull. Fortunately, it was late at night, so there was no traffic and I didn't hit anything when I lost control and spun out onto the shoulder. I had to get 5 stitches, and I've still got a nasty and very visible scar to this day. I missed one of those big steel poles that holds up street signs by about a foot, so yeah, someone else littering almost killed me. Not my story, but one that my paramedic dad has told me a couple of times. A lady was standing under a massive oak tree in her yard after a nasty storm damaged it. One of the limbs, as thick as a trunk on a normal street tree, was cracked and this lady was just staring up at it, trying to figure out what to do when it broke off and crushed her. Apparently it absolutely pancaked her torso and head, but left her limbs just fine. My dad describes it as exactly like a Bugs Bunny cartoon. Dudes too neglected, underfed, unneutered large pit bulls were fighting over the unspayed female dog. Dude stepped into the middle and had his bottom lip entirely removed to the gum line. He was also on a lot of blood thinners. He then pulled his concealed carry weapon and shot the dog, hitting it in the stomach. I felt so bad for that dog for being owned by a fricking moron. It's his fault the dog died. I picked the guy's lip up off the ground and packaged it for transport. He bled all the way to the level 1 trauma center an hour away. We ran out of absorbents and had to use Quick Clot to get the bleeding stopped. Blood was running out the back of the ambulance. Former paramedic here, I saw a man lose his life after falling 12 feet. 12 feet ain't that high, but when you land wrong, instant death. If you work at any height, wear a harness. I always like to remind people the average human is just tall enough that if they stand up straight and fall rigidly forward or backwards onto solid cement, they will gain just enough energy to impart a likely lethal blow. Apply this to things like curbs or other small surfaces and it's no contest. That's how freaking fragile we are when it comes to gravity, people. My mother was a police explorer in the 80s. She later went on to being a 911 dispatcher. She had to do a ride-along as part of police explorers or dispatch training, I can't remember which. The town she lived in has lots of gravel roads. On a blistering and muggy Iowa summer, the ambulance gets called to a motorcycle crash. They'd been speeding down the gravel and he was wearing shorts, sandals, and no helmet. He was literally pasted across the gravel, which acted like sandpaper. His head was split wide open and his brains were scattered like a Gallagher show, and the smell is something my mum says she can still smell when she tells the story. Gently cooking brains in gravel mixed with the road dust and raw meat smell. Didn't help that it was super humid, too. The girl riding with him lost 80% of her skin and broke basically everything. She died in the hospital before her parents got there. My mum made me swear to never ride motorcycles. Riding leathers aren't a fricking fashion statement. So unless you want to force some traumatized 20-year-old to scrape your face meat off the road with a garden spade, wear the proper riding gear and helmet. I'm a medic. A kid de-skinned his sausage while peeing by aggressively pulling his zipper up after he was finished. Oh god. Excuse the narrator, he's just going to narrate with his legs crossed and try not to think about the immense amount of second-hand pain that reading, writing, and narrating that last sentence caused him. Owie, 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 owie. My father-in-law is a firefighter, but the area mostly just has car accidents. So many people have their lives ruined by speeding or driving drunk. So many. I'm a cop. About 4:45 in the morning, we get a call of a burglary in progress. Now, we get off at 6:30 and have a whole night of paperwork to do right before we go home, so we weren't exactly stoked to do this. Anyways, I get there first and the 2 occupants come running out and say a guy was trying to break in and smashed a window to do it. So they ran. I'm thinking active burglary in progress, so I get my buddy rolling code 3 in case this turns sideways. We get the house surrounded and decide, well, screw it, we've got to approach somehow. We look through the fence and see what looks like a person laying on the ground. We make entry into the backyard and sure enough, there's a person laying on the ground right by the rear door. Only now we can also see the shattered glass and massive amounts of blood. We push into the backyard and the guy is clearly dead. Medics on scene confirm it. After further inspection, we realize that this clown broke the window and sliced his arm deep, right where your bicep meets your forearm. He then walked from that location to the rear door and tried to enter there for a long time by how much blood was pooled on the ground and on the door. He ended up dying, face up, spread-eagled right by the door. The homeowners had no idea who he was. I ended up going home before the whole thing was wrapped up and I never got confirmation as to anything. But our best guess was that this knucklehead was so high on crystal that he thought that this house was his and ended up smashing the window trying to get in when he couldn't open the door. He cut himself and just died. 911 call for a guy with abdominal pain. We find out the guy had shoved an egg up his butt for bedroom reasons. After he'd concluded his act of self-love, he couldn't extract the egg. He grabbed a spoon and tried to break the egg to get it out. This really happened. The guy just cut himself up real bad trying to get in there and eventually died from complications. A guy wanted to see what a ring on his eggplant felt like, so he used his wedding ring. Couldn't get it off and was ashamed to ask for help until it started turning black and blue and was in extreme pain. Either dude has giant hands or a gosh darn spaghetti wang. I'm not a first responder, but this reminds me of that one YouTuber that stuck his head in a microwave and then filled it with cement. Like literally, what did he expect? Did he even know how cement works? That it hardens? Anyways, it was a waste of time for the first responders in my opinion. Had that guy been smarter, the first responders could have actually saved a life of someone who actually needed help rather than someone who self-inflicted this idiocy upon themselves. Personally, speaking as a stupid person, I nearly cut a chunk out of my hand because I was cutting carrots on a mandolin without using the guard. I still have the scar and I haven't touched the darn thing since. What's the rarest disease you've seen a patient correctly self-diagnose? Subarachnoid hemorrhage. My guy straight up walked up to the desk and said, "I've got a headache out of nowhere. I think it's one of those spider hemorrhage things." We didn't take him seriously until the CT scan came back. To be fair, he was walking fine, talking fine, and didn't have any light sensitivity. Said the pain was a 5 out of 10. The guy could just handle pain really well. Because I have some people asking, we ended up transporting him to another hospital. We were small and not equipped for all that. We took him via ambulance to a larger hospital and was met outside the ambulance bay and he was taken directly to the surgery unit. I saw him like 6 months later in a store and he had a bit of a stutter. I would say that it was the allergy to meat after being bitten by a Lone Star tick. It was a young kid, maybe 8 to 9 years old. He would only eat tacos per the mum's instructions. He had tacos that night and had no other foods that day out of the norm, nor new medicines, lotions, detergents, shampoos in his routine. He had urticaria, hives, up and down his arms. Mum did recently remember pulling a tick that didn't look like a deer nor dog tick out of him and felt it looked like a Lone Star tick. I had no better diagnosis for the lady and referred her son to an allergist. I'd never heard of this allergy before the mum told me about it. I worked at a pediatric clinic and we had a mum properly diagnose her 9-month-old baby with Tay-Sachs disease. He wasn't progressing developmentally and ended up passing away at 18 months old. I'm actually very freaking jealous of all these doctors whose patients are helping out with the diagnosis. Mine are all just saying, "I have chest pain in my toe when I go number 2. I had an 11-year-old girl who didn't move her bowels for a week. A week! Told me she thought it was her girl parts that weren't working properly. After a full workup and finally a CT scan of her abdomen and pelvis, which I hate doing on kids because of the level of radiation, I found out her uterus was so full of blood it was causing full-on bowel obstruction. Her girl bits were so imporforate or closed up that she couldn't menstruate and all the blood just stayed in her uterus. She required an emergency hymenectomy and was sent home the next day. Hot damn if she didn't call it from the get-go. Scurvy. Why he didn't just start eating foods with vitamin C, I'll never know. That was right up there with diseases that I just didn't think people got anymore. The old pirate disease. Classic. Just goes to show you that some kids do not want to eat their fruits and vegetables, and some parents sadly can't be bothered making them do so. Although the replies to this story were full of college-age students actually getting the same disease from only eating cup noodles, so I guess it could just be a really irresponsible adult as well. When my oldest was born, he peeled a little, like babies may do, but it kept getting worse and he was flaky and had scales. The pediatrician told me he had dry skin and to lotion him up. Dr. Google claimed it was a condition called ichthyosis, but that was super rare, so no one believed me. Anyways, fast forward 6 months and a referral to a dermatologist later, and he's got ichthyosis. Also, after my first was born, I had excruciating pain just under my ribcage, mostly after I ate. Tums did nothing. Gas X did nothing. Did a little Googling and it sounded like gallbladder attacks, only it's on the wrong side. I go to my GP, get an ultrasound. My gallbladder was full of stones. Got a referral to a surgeon who dragged me for a month, claiming it couldn't be my gallbladder, the pain was on the wrong side. Meanwhile, I was having attacks after every meal and stopped eating except ginger ale and club crackers. I lost over 10 pounds. Call the surgeon daily in tears. Finally, he agrees to operate, but right before the procedure tells me that once my gallbladder is gone, I'll still have problems. Woke up from surgery and found out my gallbladder was worse than they thought, so it needed to come out anyway. 2.5 years later and I haven't had any more attacks. Guess it was my gallbladder after all. Bird mite infestation. The lady wasn't taken seriously at first and came off as a psycho. Nope, the birds built a nest in her AC ductwork. Patient here. Self-diagnosed a still unknown fungal infection inside both eyes. It took making them glow with a rock lamp to get attention. Kept seeing strands in both eyes, then wow, that UV lamp. Ended up on one heck of a cocktail to save my sight. Kids, don't wash your eyes with river water in a tropical rainforest. Just say no. A nurse friend brought her newborn to the pediatrician in '63 and told him her son had Wilms tumor. The guy blew her off and told her she was a nervous mother and a little bossy boots. The kid was starting to crump when a pediatric oncology guy noticed and saved the baby. My friend dumped the pediatrician. A patient turned up clutching some internet printouts about visceral leishmaniasis. Luckily, I managed to resist saying anything sarcastic as that's exactly what she had. I appreciate it's not uncommon worldwide, but in UK hospitals it's pretty damn rare. And I was grateful for the printouts, it saved me a lot of searching. As a physician and a med school doctor, it's pretty distressing to read all of these. I told the doctor I had, enter the fairly common disease and typical symptoms here, but he or she didn't believe me. We teach our med students to ask the patients if they have any idea what they may have. Doctors need to take the patient's opinions seriously. Much of the time, the patient has already spent hours researching the disease and may have some experience with it, especially if it's a familial disease. I may require my students to listen to these stories. I'm not a medical worker, but my grandmother self-diagnosed herself with Chiari. She had been having problems and everyone in the family tried to tell her it was nothing. She ended up needing brain surgery and still suffers from it. I had a resident tell me a patient was in the ER saying he had a worm in his eye. Why does he think that? I asked. Because he feels something in his eye. I patiently explained to the resident that often people have a speck of dust, so you just have to look carefully all around the eyelids under the slit lamp, which has a microscope. As I was talking and examining the patient, lo and behold, a worm wriggled right under the surface and I jumped back and nearly fell off my chair. It turns out the patient was visiting from Africa and his father was a veterinarian, who told him to come to the hospital to take the worm out. These parasites are common in Africa, not so much in the US. The entire infectious disease department was very excited. Years ago, a woman who'd been taking calcium supplements made from ground horse bones diagnosed herself with lead poisoning. I recall she was a movie actress. Impressive in that I think none of her doctors saw this, and there was at the time no reason to believe that a calcium supplement would have a lot of lead in it. But of course animals store lead in their bones, and until leaded gasoline was phased out, every animal pretty much was getting very high exposure. I have to add an editorial comment about lead and mercury. The counter-argument I've heard when I expressed concerns about exposure from fish and gasoline is that, "You're gonna die anyway, you could be hit by a bus." I'm puzzled to the point of anger by such stupid responses. Is the argument since you can be hit by a bus, you should not try to avoid being poisoned? Especially since the result of neurological damage is not sudden death or even death at all, but rather a sometimes hideous diminution of quality of life. Who would say, sure, take off 10 IQ points, I might be hit by a bus. Sure, that makes sense. 5th year med student here, diagnosed myself with lymphoma. Everyone thought I was being a classic paranoid med student, but it turns out I was right. Finished chemo 2 weeks ago. I would imagine that just simply learning of all these completely horrifying ailments could make anyone a hypochondriac. Good on you for staving off the self-doubt and working out what was really going on. Not particularly rare, but I had a guy diagnose himself with Guillain-Barré syndrome and a lady diagnose herself with Charcot-Marie tooth disease. I worked in a health department for a while looking at infectious diseases. Two things seemed constant. 1. The vets are really good at self-diagnosing zoonotic diseases. 2. Their doctors rarely believe them. In my time, we saw two uncommon diseases: psittacosis and tularemia. Vets are well trained anyway, but to be fair, it's a pretty obvious leap from "I treated a dog with X" to "oh, now I have X too." The psittacosis was from some kind of exotic bird and had infected the owner. The owner had already had a cough when visiting the clinic, and the vet recommended that the owner see her GP. But the GP refused to order the tests until the patient was extremely sick. If I recall correctly, the lady survived, but a lawsuit came from the ordeal. No idea how it ended. Bird survived too, I believe. A different vet herself got tularemia, treating a stray cat that was brought into the clinic. To be fair, it's very rare in cats as well. The cat sadly died despite treatment. The vet's GP was not convinced she could have contracted the disease so quickly. The health department had to intervene and insist the vet get treatment. I honestly have no idea why anyone would flat out deny the possibility when a known exposure is present. ER physician here. I once had a patient, a middle-aged man, who self-diagnosed a glioblastoma multiforme. It turns out he'd been having headaches, nausea, blurry vision for about 6 months. He didn't seek medical help until a couple of weeks before I'd seen him. At first he was treated with simple NSAIDs and rest, but was ordered a full set of tests. Between visits to his primary care physician, he saw an episode of the television series ER, where one of the characters had similar symptoms and was diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme. So when he came to the ER, because he developed dysarthria and a persistent headache, he bluntly said he might have this particular disease. Obviously, I didn't believe him since glioblastomas are not very common and television is fantasy. Well, after the MRI scan showed it had that particular brain cancer, I couldn't help but marvel at his self-diagnosis. But deep down, I wish he was completely wrong, because glioblastoma multiforme is one of the most aggressive brain cancers there is, with an extremely low survival rate. When I told him about his diagnosis, he didn't get angry or sad, just said it was okay. He knew it all along and was at peace with his immediate future. I followed up on him for some time and he died 3 months after my visit. It was one of those weird circumstances that, in my line of work, makes you think that there's something bigger than us all around us. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I had a patient who correctly diagnosed herself with mastitis, although she was very worried that she had had an inflammatory carcinoma of the chest. To be fair, they can look similar. Another time, I had a patient correctly diagnose a lump in her breast as a fibroadenoma. I was very impressed. Man, I got a giant abscess, and everyone kept coming to look at this giant, pus, blood-filled bubble on my chest. No one had ever seen mastitis go this wrong before. Stupid family doctor made me suffer and ignored me for ages until I ended up in the ER. The nurse admitting me was like, "How long has this been going on?" To be fair, it only grew and became crazy that morning. But the lump I had would not go away no matter what I tried. Is it just me, or are doctors sometimes like, "A totally abnormal thing going on with your body? Let's run some tests." Unless it's on a lady's part, in which case it's just a lady mystery. Probably hysteria. Oh, it's not just you. They've done all kinds of studies. I went into the ER in severe pain and was sure it was kidney stones. I told the nurse that and got a long lecture on how I do not self-diagnose, just tell the doctors my symptoms and let him figure it out because he's the professional. The doctor comes in, I describe my symptoms, leaving off my ideas on the matter, and they do some blood and pee tests. The doctor comes back and it turns out I did have kidney stones. I looked at the nurse, who happened to be in the same room at the time, and she just huffed and walked out. The doctor looked confused and I told him the whole story. He laughed and said something to the effect of course patients should tell me what they think the issue is and why. I may not come to the same conclusion as you, but every bit of data helps. Not quite the same, but this was so creepy and sad I had to share. One of my dad's co-workers went to pick up a patient with the ambulance, and they started talking during the drive to the hospital. The patient told the co-worker that he had a very special type of cancer, and started listing his symptoms. Coworker thought to himself, well crap, this sounds like a lot of the issues I've been having, and decided to get himself checked out. It turns out he had the exact same type of disease and died a few months later. Damn sad that even catching it ahead of time didn't help the guy in question here. I don't even know if it's silver lining that they got a few months to sort out their estate. Honestly, I'd rather not know and then cark it one day without living in dread, but maybe it wouldn't have been that simple either. It's not rare or a disease, but it always terrifies me when a patient says they're going to die and then later actually freaking dies. We had a girl say this and then later die from a PE. She was young too. Just so we're clear, this girl died within 45 minutes of predicting said death. She was unloaded from the gurney after being brought into the ER for difficulty breathing and started complaining of back pain once on the bed that was brand new for her. Then 45 minutes or so later, we pronounced her time of death. The nurse was traumatized because this young girl said it with such conviction. We later found out this girl was on birth control pills and figured it was the reason she threw a clot. Sad day, man. I should probably leave this here. How often do blood clots occur? Blood clots are generally rare but sometimes occur in otherwise healthy people, even those not taking CHCs. Between 1 and 5 of every 10,000 women who are not pregnant and not using CHCs will experience a blood clot in any given year. This number increases slightly if the person uses CHCs. Between 3 and 9 of every 10,000 CHC users will experience a blood clot in any given year. This girl might have had a bunch of other risk factors for a PE as well. Possible long periods of immobilization, recent surgery, trauma, who knows. The only risk factor I caught wind of was birth control pills. It's something providers in the ER typically ask about if a female comes in complaining of dyspnea with no history of respiratory problems. I work in pain management and a lady had symptoms that other doctors didn't believe. She was labeled as a substance addict or someone seeking narcotics. She came to our office in tears, just telling me she felt pain in random places of her body with no abnormal imaging or other symptoms. She stated several times that she felt she had something inexplicably wrong with her and that she wasn't lying for pills. We discovered she has a very rare case of chronic regional pain syndrome, more severe than any other case we'd seen. Sadly, there's no cure, but at least she has an explanation as to why she has pain for no evident reason. Not a medical worker, but I am a rare case of WebMD being right about cancer. Felt a lump in my throat for upwards of a year and a half, but doctors kept telling me it was in my head. They stuck cameras down my throat and nothing. It took an ultrasound after giving myself up and my PCP saying my thyroid felt slightly enlarged for a doctor to find it. One ultrasound and a biopsy later, they found out I had stage 2 papillary thyroid cancer that metastasized to 18 lymph nodes. Myself with lupus. Been having issues with chest pain and a myriad of other symptoms that never made sense together. GPs don't want to look at the mountain of records they have for you, just the problem at hand. All tests for a diagnosis came back in normal parameters, but I insisted on a fail-safe I'd read about. I asked to be tested for syphilis. But you have no symptoms for that. I know. It's because lupus will show as a false positive on that. Done, and I have lupus. I also diagnosed myself with lupus. Went to 2 doctors and they didn't believe me. I was 16 and they claimed I had the teenage blues or it was anemia symptoms. Finally went to a 3rd doctor when I couldn't go on feeling like crap any longer. Turns out I was in stage 4 kidney failure from lupus and they were like, yeah, you need to see a rheumatologist tomorrow. Pyloric stenosis. A couple brought in their little one with exorcist-type projectile vomiting. Exam and ultrasound confirmed the diagnosis. My daughter had this. I didn't diagnose it though. The doctors kept telling me there was nothing wrong with her and she was just spitting up, even though she couldn't keep anything down. I finally took her for a 3rd opinion and there it was. The doctor said the other ones probably didn't diagnose it because it's rare for girls to have it. She had surgery the next morning and she's fine now 15 years later. Found out later that a bunch of relatives, all girls, have had this. My older brother is developmentally disabled. For the longest time, all the psychologists and school counselors said he was ADHD and had some learning disabilities that he may have obtained in utero. My badass mum, with only a high school diploma, never really accepted that this was all that was going on with him, but listened to the doctors anyway. Fast forward to when my brother was 10 years old and my mother read an article about Fragile X syndrome. She happened to read about a rare form of it called Frax-E. The article perfectly described my brother's condition. My mother then decided to talk to a genetic counselor about getting my brother tested. The genetic counselor kind of scoffed at her diagnosis but went along with it anyways. Lo and behold, my brother had the exact form of Fragile X she had read about. My mum not only diagnosed my brother, but she also found out that our family was a carrier for Frax E. It turned out my mum was a carrier and my grandpa had Frax E. It was amazing because all my grandpa's life he fought with feelings of inadequacy because school and learning new things were really hard for him. He was held back 3 times in high school. When he found out there was a legitimate medical reason for this, it completely changed his outlook. We had a 20-year-old patient come into the hospital because his girlfriend was laying on his chest and told him his heartbeat was a little fast and sounded weird. He came in and said he had an irregular heartbeat or arrhythmia. According to his Google research, he said he may have AFib. He was correct. While watching a documentary about Asperger's during class, I had a portent and slow realization that what they talked about was disturbingly accurate on a personal level. After running through some screenings, months later, because diagnosis screenings are far more focused on children than adults, the doctors were wondering how it managed to be undetected during my childhood. I actually think a lot of people who are on the spectrum on some level probably go through life completely unaware of it, just due to a lot of pressure while growing up to repress or ignore their more neurodivergent tendencies rather than diagnose and treat them. And it was even worse for the people before our generation too. Not really a rare disease, but when I worked in the district hospital, I had a patient who came in for a 3-day fever saying that she might have hepatitis A because she had some shellfish over the weekend. She had no other symptoms. I laughed it off. Her full blood count did seem to indicate a viral infection, but I was thinking of dengue, which is a very common thing in that area, or just your run-of-the-mill viral fever. Fearing the former, I scheduled her to come on Saturday, 3 days later, to review her dengue antibodies test result. It so happened that I was working half-day that Saturday. It so happened the lady was yellow on that Saturday, jaundiced from the hepatitis, and the IgM came back negative. Boy, was I humbled. She was hospitalized in a tertiary center and came for a follow-up a few weeks after, and she was fit as a horse. I knew a guy who diagnosed himself with appendicitis within 1.5 hours of the symptoms appearing. It was very impressive for someone with no medical expertise. Rarest diseases are often easier to self-diagnose than medically diagnose, as the patient will jump to the worst conclusion with no data, and the doctor will start at the most likely and test down from there. I had a guy come in one night and diagnose himself with a broken tibia. Wasn't as impressive as it sounds as it was sticking through his skin. I correctly self-diagnosed my hypochondria. I diagnosed myself with a condition called hidradenitis suppurativa. I've struggled with it for 25 years. Been to several doctors who just threw a 2-week antibiotic at me and told me to come back if it returned. When I asked why I was having one of these flare-ups, they usually just shrugged and said I was just one of those people who were prone. I was never given a diagnosis. I started really looking into it about a year ago and went to a new doctor where I explained in detail why I believed I had the condition. After examining me, she agreed and has been wonderful in helping me treat this, with practical remedies and an open mind and listening ear. So glad that I found her. I self-diagnosed myself with allergy to carrot antifreeze protein. For some years, after eating raw carrots or having fresh carrot juice from the fridge, I was experiencing a tingling sensation in the throat and I could feel it swelling. At some point I realized I was allergic to carrots, but only to the raw ones. The weird thing was that this wasn't always the case. I sometimes had raw carrots and had no symptoms at all. The cooked ones were fine. Then about 8 to 10 years ago, I watched a program in which they mentioned that carrots can produce a natural and, at the time, only plant antifreeze protein. Carrots make it in response to excessive cold. They also said that some people may be allergic to it. This protein is also broken down while carrots are cooked. This struck me as, that's it! So I did some tests. I can happily eat raw carrots that have been pulled out of the ground with no symptoms. However, raw carrots that have been in the fridge for some time will give me narrowed and itchy throat. What is the most disturbing thing you've overheard a parent tell their kid? Heard someone get really mad at their kid, who was 7 or 8, in the grocery store, and they screamed, "This is why your dog ran away. He hated you." Like, geez, lady, chill. I wish you were never born. In a grocery store after a small child was acting up. I was leaning against a telephone pole at a bus stop, just waiting for a friend to meet me there and then walk to my place. A woman and a little girl were sitting at the stop when a car pulled up. The lady stands up and looks at the little girl and says, "If I'm not back in an hour, call your grandma and tell her I said for both of you to get out of this town and disappear." Then she got in the car and it drove off as my friend came around the corner. I dated a girl in high school who was adopted. One day I was at the mall with her and her mother when they started fighting and her mother yelled, "Well, now I know why your mother put you up for adoption." It was pretty much the worst thing I've ever heard. This guy I dated had an adopted sister and his mum said the same stuff. She called her a little hussy as well. I was helping my dad fix one of his rentals. The toilet was plugged up and we found out that it was clogged with numerous action figures. My dad asked the renter's child if he was the one who put them in the toilet. To my surprise, he admitted it completely and apologized. Immediately, the renter dragged her kid by the arm into another room. We could hear everything said, which should have been obvious to her. She said, "Don't you ever betray you or yours again. If someone asks you if you did something like that, you say no. You understand me?" Ugh. Not me, but my mother. At the elementary school we worked at, there was one mother who constantly bullied her son, including pinching him over the slightest things, blatantly favoring his siblings over him, and making him walk to school in the rain. My mum reminisced how she rarely saw the kid being happy. One afternoon during my mum's parent and bus pickup duties, she observed the kid's mum picking him up from school and yelling at him. As usual. Through tears, he asked his mum why he couldn't just go live with his dad. "Then you don't even have to see me anymore. Why can't I go stay with Daddy?" And her answer? "Because he wants you," before slamming the door and driving off. I still don't understand how that woman never lost custody of him. "Out of all my children, you are the biggest disappointment." Oof. I sincerely hope you are listening to Lucille Bluth, because that's the only person with whom that statement has any chance of being remotely funny from. And even then, only if she was talking to Job. But seriously, that's freaking tragic and probably broke a kid. Not really public, but when I was in high school, I was at my best friend's house hanging out. He got in an argument with his mum and she got so teed off that she said, "I honestly wish I didn't have to put up with your bullcrap. You're only here because of divorced whoopee." Meaning he was conceived when his parents did the deed after their divorce. I was sitting there in stunned silence as she storms off. My friend just starts laughing as if it's the funniest thing he's ever heard. He would even proudly tell people that he was here because of divorced whoopee, with this big grin on his face. Just had this happen today. Hold the dog's leash or I'll strangle you with it. This was said by a father to his 5-year-old kid. The dog was a youngish-looking German Shepherd. My son has hydranencephaly, and his head is a little larger than normal because of a buildup of CSF fluid. Once at an appointment, a kid in a wheelchair, probably 5 or 6 years old, said quietly and innocently to his dad, "Look at that kid's head." And his dad replies, "Don't talk about him, you're in a wheelchair." Now, I'm all for parents using my son as a teaching opportunity to break stigma on special needs kids, or educate their kids on how to speak politely, say hi, or ask a polite question about special needs people, but I was shocked that this kid's dad said that to him. Don't make me regret not going to the clinic. We were getting in line to get ice cream when I noticed $20 on the ground. I asked if it belonged to anyone. A middle-aged woman and a teenage girl, presumably her daughter sitting near us, noticed. The mother nudged the daughter and said, "I think that's yours." And the daughter didn't even look away from her ice cream and said, "No, it's not." The mother presses on, saying, "Are you sure? I think it is." This back and forth continued. Clearly it isn't hers and the mother wants her to take the $20 anyway. Eventually the kid gives up and agrees, saying she thinks it's hers. Taking the $20 wasn't what bothered us. It was insisting your daughter do the wrong thing even when she clearly doesn't want to lie. I overheard a father shout, "Stop crying. Why do you always have to make everything about you? Everything is just the worst thing ever, isn't it?" At his hysterical toddler. Today. If you get hurt, you're in trouble. If you get in trouble, I'm gonna hurt you. The other day, the couple that lives in the apartment downstairs from me were outside trying to get their kids to be quiet and get in their car seats. But they were crying and arguing. The dad was going on with the "shut up, stop crying, stop yelling" stuff, but it was only making them worse. Then the mum really calmly walked over to the door and said, "I'm tired of you two fighting. I don't want 2 kids anymore. If this is what having 2 kids is like, I don't want 2 kids. I'm giving one of you guys up. You'd better decide which one of you is staying." That shut them up though. I should clarify that when I say it's disturbing, it's only really messed up out of context, and I kind of understand why she'd say that. Honestly, I thought it was pretty funny. Was at a ghetto CVS, and a parent told her child something along the lines of, If you keep crying, I'm going to pull out a piece and shoot ya. If you don't shut the frick up, I'm gonna beat the crap out of you. This was on bass and the man was yelling into his car. I'll always regret not calling the cops. A father telling his preteen daughter how she was going to grow up to be a hussy just like her mother. She couldn't have been more than 11. On the train around early December last year, I overheard a father shouting at his, couldn't have been much older than 6, son, and threatening him with, "Santa won't bring you any presents if you keep acting like a little crap bag." To which the kid replied, "How can you make Santa do that?" And the father, kneeling down to make eye contact with his son, said, "I'll wait for him to come down the chimney, and then I'll punch all his fricking teeth out, that's how." I'm sure the son loved both Christmas and his dad after that. My fiancé and I were at dinner last year, and we were seated next to this really bizarre-looking family. It was busy and tables were jammed close, so we heard everything they said. The daughter had to have been around 13 and was carrying a little kid's stuffed animal and holding it the whole time. The mum wouldn't let the daughter order what she wanted and started body-shaming her kid, who was skinny but clearly going through puberty, telling her how disgusting and fat her hips were starting to get. Mum, by the way, was morbidly obese. Of course. So the girl ended up having to split a salad with her dad, while her slightly older brother had like 3 plates full of food sat right in front of him. What do you even do when you witness unfolding childhood traumas like this taking place right in front of you? This is actually mortifying, and I would love to know in the comments, even if I never end up running into any of it myself. I heard one of my old neighbors say to her son, "If you keep crying like a little B-word, I'll put you in a dress." You want to wear a dress? No? Then shut the F up. I was outside gardening with my daughter, who was about 6 at the time. Her eyes just went wide and she asked me why she would talk to her kids like that. I didn't really have a good answer. I was at Kroger browsing through an aisle. 2 young men were there with an older man, I'm guessing their father. One of them was talking about how he beat the crap out of his girlfriend recently and how he felt like a terrible person about it. The older gent put his hands on his shoulders and says, "Son, boys will be boys." I always tell my 1-year-old I'm going to give her a knuckle sandwich if she whacks me with her maraca again. Then she laughs and donks me on the head with it. Threatening to bite her little toesies off doesn't work either. "Stop mucking about, you little C-word, or I'll frickin' thrash ya." A mother talking to her child while walking them to school in front of all the other kids and their parents. This was in a low-income neighborhood in Australia. I used to work in a kindergarten and we had a kid around 3 years old who wouldn't and mostly couldn't talk yet. He said a few words at home, but while in kindergarten he only made noises and gestures to get us to understand, but was making progress and we were getting medical help at the request of the mother. At this time, it was popular between the older kids to go to each other's places after kindergarten, and this kid really wanted to join that, but the mother's answer? "When you start talking to your friends, you can go to their place after kindergarten." And no surprise, all our progress was lost, and he locked himself in even more. I was in shock. I just couldn't believe what I'd heard. This woman was so unhappy with her son not talking, nagging day in and day out that we must help her, and she just throws every piece of progress out the window. It was so sad. This actually was just said to me. It happened last year. I'm a dancer and I used to compete on teams and as a soloist. I don't really compete anymore, college, you know? One day I was competing my solo and just touching up my makeup in the dressing room where I accidentally was in the way of a mum and her daughter who was my age. I said, "Sorry, I'll be out of your way in a second," and the mum said I was totally fine and something about sharing a bathroom with siblings. I laugh and say, "Oh yeah, I get you. I have 3 younger siblings myself," and the mum says, "Really? I would have stopped after you." Right in front of her kid. I smiled uncomfortably, grabbed my bag, and moved to the other side of the room. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. My first job in my small little town in Australia was manning the toy section of the local Target. It was a lower-end suburb, so there was a pretty big Indigenous population that stayed in the area. Most of the people actually working at the Target were either white or some suitably civilized shade of brown. Anyway, what I'm saying is everyone working there was slightly racist and would pay a little more attention to anyone Indigenous who happened to walk in. To reduce shrinkage, of course. So one day I'm in the toy aisle rearranging all the Barbie dolls that some idiot kids had taken off the shelf and abandoned in homewares when this Aboriginal lady walks by with her daughter. The girl couldn't have been more than 8, and like any 8-year-old, she naturally makes a beeline for the Barbies and picks one up to look at it. Her mum, who let her hand go for a moment, yells, "You put that down or they'll think you're stealing it," and grabs the girl by the hand and walks off. I felt like crap, not the least because that B-word Sandra, who manned the front of the store, had been quietly trailing the two of them since they entered. Imagine being surrounded by that level of hostility your entire life, that you have to pass wisdom like, don't pick stuff up from the shelf or people will think you're stealing, to your kids. People who think Indigenous Aussies should just get over it have no gosh darn idea how bad it is for them in some areas. Made me ashamed to work there. Not someone else, but me. When I was 11 or 12, we went to Disney and my dad kept bugging me about why I looked so unhappy. I wasn't, I just have a resting B-word face. Eventually, we were at some chicken restaurant surrounded by tons of people and he called me an ungrateful B-word in front of about 30 people. Just a month ago, me and my boyfriend went to Disney World in Florida. While eating lunch in a quieter, more isolated area, we saw a dad drag his 8-ish-year-old daughter to a table near us and in hushed tones, but loud enough for us to hear, he said, "You don't deserve to be here, you ungrateful B-word." The rest of the family arrived shortly after with trays of food and the dad pulled out a tinfoil-wrapped sandwich from the mum's purse and threw it at his daughter while the parents and 2 other kids ate the burgers and fries from the quick-serve restaurant. I just felt sick and wanted to cry. I saw a 2 to 3-year-old kid lagging behind his mum. She turned to him and said, "Get up here, motherfricker." Wasn't super disturbing, just funny and kind of vaguely racist. I was iced in Birmingham, Alabama earlier this year. While I was getting some continental breakfast, a man walked up to the coffee dispenser with his daughter of about 4 years of age. He says to her, "Honey, always like your coffee how you like your men, light and sweet." Nothing like vague Alabaman racial bias instilled at a young age. I overheard a mother tell her son that he'd have to hold it in until church was over. The kid was obviously desperate to go and the preacher had only just begun his sermon, but the mother was intent on making him stay for the entire service. I'm the parent in this one. My son has one of those kitchen playsets and various toy or utensil or food items, and refers to playing with the set as home living. An awesome name for it he picked up at daycare. One day, during the height of his infatuation with home living, we were at a store and he wasn't following me, and he kept grabbing stuff off the shelf or was in general engaging in a behavior that I needed to correct him on. So I told him, "Son, you need to listen to me or you're going to lose your home living privilege." It pretty quickly dawned on me that without context, that must have sounded pretty concerning to people around us. That's wonderfully unfortunate. I wonder if you got glared out of the store by everyone in hearing radius. Who knows, maybe a kid as rambunctious as that would enjoy an evening out in the tent in the backyard. Honestly, the young narrator would probably have been thrilled at that prospect. Funny what'll interest a kid under 10 years old. I was in Walmart about 10 years ago. I saw the exact moment a woman grabbed her small son, about 6, by the arm as he was crying and she shook him a few times while yelling, "Break yourself, fool." I was at a condo community pool and overheard children berating this Asian couple. The kids were straight up telling them to go back to China and using slurs. The Asian couple were infuriated and told the kid that he's being racist. They then turned to the mother, and instead of apologizing, the mother told the kids to continue what they were saying and that the Asian couple had no right to tell their kids off. I had no idea what was going on until I put the pieces together an hour after the event. It still makes me mad to this day. My dad used to be a police officer. I was at the grocery store with him, and a woman in line near us had a kid who wouldn't stop crying. She pointed in our direction and told her kid my dad would take him to jail if he didn't shut up. After a day of whale watching, my girlfriend and I stopped off in Buena Park to have dinner. We were sitting in a booth by a window where she could watch the rain. A homeless man came up the sidewalk, pushing a shopping cart overloaded with stuff. She was wearing a halter top and stretch shorts, but it's California and not really cold out. As she's passing, one of her cart wheels hits something and her cart almost tips over. She frantically struggles to keep it upright and only loses the rolled-up blankets and some clothes. She was trying to pick up her stuff, but it wasn't easy with the rain coming down. I heard laughing and turned to see a family, Mum, Dad, and 2 kids, a boy and a girl, looking about 9 and 12 respectively, watching the woman and having a grand time laughing at her misfortune. Dad pointed at the woman and said something, making everyone roar with laughter. And then the daughter said something. I couldn't hear everything, but the parents were obviously teaching their children to look down and even ridicule the less fortunate. I guess this isn't that disturbing as much as it is what the frick. I once overheard a woman yelling at her toddler for crying. She said, "Shut up, why are you crying? You're acting like such a baby." I don't know which. Maybe it's because it's less than 2 years old and that's how it communicates with the world and lets you know something isn't right. I will not allow you to go to college. This person wasn't talking to the kid, but he was right next to her listening. I heard someone tell her friend that her kid would never move out and he'd be that loser living in his parents' basement all his life, right in front of him. To supplement that awfulness, anytime I did anything my mum didn't like I didn't clean something to her standard, she'd tell me what a loser I was and how worthless I was. I think that's why it bothers me that someone would say that to their kid. Just last night, at my significant other's very Christian parents' house, his mum said to their 27-year-old daughter who's dating for the second time in her life, "That sounds to me like you're pursuing him, and I don't like that." It was eye-opening. Pretty much everything in this thread is things my mother said to me as a child, or rather screamed at me, except the swearing. She'll never swear. Swearing is punishable by one heck of a beating in her book. Some of the things she thinks are more acceptable to say to a child than swear words include, "I've had enough of you, I'm putting you in a home," she'd pick up the phone and pretend to dial, or "Stop that noise or I'll beat you black and blue." In this case, I'd been crying because I was 4 and my brother had just thrown me, literally out of a bunk bed. I'd already told her this. Here's some others. "You're a B-word, no wonder all your boyfriends leave you. They find out what you're really like." I was a teenager when she said that one. "If it wasn't for me, you'd be starving on the streets because no one else would want you. If you don't stop complaining, I'm going to tell that policeman what you're like at home and he'll throw you straight in prison. Your friends' parents wouldn't put up with this behavior. They'd have got rid of you a long time ago." And so on and so forth, you get the idea. It wasn't like verbal, but once I saw a kid and his mum at a Toys R Us and the child touched one of the displays. His mother panicked at this and yanked his hand away and held it up in the air as she ran him over to the bathroom, presumably to wash his hands. It was so dramatic. "I brought you into this world and I can take you out of it," said my own mother on several occasions. As much as I can't stand kids, this teed me off. In a Walmart checkout line, go figure, some B-word looked at her 5-year-old and told him she'd strangle the breath out of your worthless butt if you don't shut the frick up. Was at the Science Center in St. Louis on Valentine's Day with my girlfriend at the time. We were walking across the covered bridge connecting the 2 sides and there was a mum with her child walking in front of us. He was maybe a foot in front of her when she screamed at the top of her lungs, "If you keep walking that far in front of me, someone is going to steal you," and just kept walking. The kid didn't even react, and the mum never closed the very small gap between her and her son. Most disturbing to me isn't the nasty or violent stuff, it's the subtle everyday things that bit by bit make the kid view themselves as a bad person. If you tell a child they're naughty or difficult or awkward or whatever every day for years, that child is going to grow up to be those things. It's why when I'm at work, I work in a preschool, I'm careful to chastise children's actions, not the children themselves when they do something wrong. So there's a noodle place near where I used to live. It's basically a shack that the owners have to build from scratch every night when they open. Pretty third world, I know. Anyway, me and my roommates were having dinner when we overheard the owner of the noodle place saying something to her 2-year-old daughter sucking on a soda bottle. It was something along the lines of, "You better learn how to use your mouth like that now because you'll be doing it a lot when you're older." Me and my roommates stared at each other in disbelief. You have till the count of 3 to stop crying. 1 second passed. 3. The store went dead silent after that and I never heard that voice again. Okay, this isn't something I heard, but it was something I saw, and it was pretty weird and quite disturbing. So I was working as a tourist informer, and then a woman came in with a young girl. She wasn't too young, maybe around 11 or 12, very quiet, quite normal looking, until I realized the woman was keeping the girl on a fricking leash. I'm not kidding. She had like those corsets with leashes that people put on their babies, but for a tween. Their mother just looked at the information and left the girl on the leash. I was like, what the cosmic eternal frick did I just see? What weird habits have you developed from growing up poor? I still can't bring myself to write in Mad Lib books or on things that could be reused. Growing up ultra poor, it was a rare treat to get something frivolous, but Mad Libs were also semi-educational, so every once in a while I'd get a new Mad Lib book from my dad. But I felt a ton of anxiety about wasting them by directly writing in them. If I numbered the blanks and then wrote on a separate sheet of paper with the corresponding numbers, I could reuse the books over and over again. Being really poor made me live in this awful anxiety-driven state of don't use it up because you might not get any more anytime soon, and you'd better use it all and not waste anything, which made me overthink and overanalyze my actions. I was confronted by this preference to not mess things up in my master's degree program, because the professor would expressly tell me it was okay to write on the handouts because she'd share the digital copies with us, so we'd have a clean copy to use in our own classes later, and I still couldn't do it. Using plastic grocery bags as trash bags. Don't really see the point in using actual garbage bags. Anytime someone tries to buy me food or anything for me, I always go for the dollar menu or try to go for the lowest amount even if they say buy whatever. I mean, that's just courtesy. When people offer to buy me Starbucks, I order tea. It's the cheapest thing you can get from there. There's an expectation not to order the lobster equivalent on a menu when someone is being nice to you. Operating under a barter system with friends. Where I grew up, there wasn't much money. So people often bartered goods and services and often exchanged small handmade gifts as payment. Then I moved and discovered that wealthier people don't do that at all. Not letting anyone in the house. Even though I don't have to as much, I still calculate how many hours I have to work in order to afford something to decide if it's a need or a want. Do I want to work 2.5 hours to fill my gas tank, or 2.5 hours to buy a single t-shirt? I want the shirt, but the shirt isn't going to get me to work. I really want a Switch and several new games, and I'll have to work at least 9 days to afford the Switch and the 3 games I want. And after I've worked those 9 days, I can't justify spending the money on the Switch and the games. The narrator finds that whenever they have a big expense on the horizon, or something they've been saving towards for a while, one starts to think of other purchases in terms of what fraction of the big spend they would equate to. It gets really hard to enjoy things like an annual gym membership when you realize it's 1/100th of an apartment deposit. It makes you value it more though, I guess. For a brighter side to this, the following commenter provides a counter-argument. This was a huge issue for me. My husband helped me realize that hours of enjoyment are worth something at least. What I did to get our Switch and 2 games is to save 2 days of work time per paycheck. I sacrificed some other things for entertainment and bought it for him on Father's Day. We don't have kids, but he is my puppy papa. After calling around to find the cheapest used Switch combo, we've already enjoyed it for hours more than I worked to get it. Also, our nieces think we're nothing short of gods. I legit cringe when I buy anything slightly expensive, and I find myself constantly buying the super cheap store brands instead of the name brand stuff. I mean, Costco liquor is literally made in the same plants as the name brand stuff. I dated a richer girl who told me she'd never had Chef Boyardee or SpaghettiOs before, but was disgusted by them. Apparently her parents had always told her, growing up, that canned food was for dogs. What the frick? Her saying that hit especially close to home, because I eat SpaghettiOs with a grilled cheese at least 3 times a week. My dad grew up even poorer than me, and he won't eat Chef Boyardee because it's so crappy. I like cheap wine. Even when my budget allows for a $75 bottle, I'll buy the $10. I still prefer thin, rough bath towels. Big fluffy towels are too fluffy. It feels weird when fluffy towels get wet. I grew up middle class and I hated fluffy towels. My mother would buy new ones every couple of months, and it drove me freaking bonkers to the point I just stashed my own supply of rough towels. The other day I was at a thrift store and I saw some towels in a pack and I brought them. $6 brought me 10 towels in what I consider to be perfect condition. After some hot washes with enzymatic detergent and borax, they were amazing. I love these towels. I'm not sure if it's odd or unusual, but my parents used to tell me, eat all the food served, since we were poor and sometimes they wouldn't eat so I could have a full serving of food. I'm no longer poor, but I still eat the full plate no matter how full I am. And yes, I'm aware that you can put food in the fridge for the next day, so it's not the most healthy thing either, but it's the flawed solution my parents found so I wouldn't be picky with the food or not eat on a whim. This really messed me up as a kid. Now I just go without and I eat leftovers from the plates of the kids I watch for friends and family. They think it's funny that I'm only hungry when cooking and when everything else is done. I hope they never figure out how poor I really am. Toast with butter and cinnamon is my favorite go-to for breakfast. Eating fast. I had 4 siblings and only so much food was made for dinner. If you didn't eat fast, you didn't eat. Yeah, I know the feeling. However, I learned to eat fast from prison. I haven't served time since '94, but I still wolf down my food to this day. It's a hard habit to break. I just buy 1 pair of trainers and I wear them until they fall off my feet. Then I buy a new pair. I make good money as an adult, but I still do this. I also don't buy branded clothes. I worked with a guy and we earned the same money, yet he collected limited edition trainers and drove an expensive car. I just couldn't comprehend the waste in money. I cycle everywhere because it's good for my health. I moved to Switzerland in a few weeks for a job that pays 2.5 times my current salary, and I still intend to cycle everywhere. I am, to this day, unable to manage my money. Going from not being able to spend anything to having at least $300 left for whatever I want made me spend recklessly. You'd think it would be the opposite growing up poor, but spending feels so good. This is fairly common. Most people in your situation will buy things since experience has taught them they don't know when they'll have money to spend things on again. So they end up spending it all, thus having no more money. I love Little Caesars $5 pizza more than fancy brick oven pizza because spending that gives me too much anxiety to enjoy the food. I was visiting my folks and my mum ordered pizza from Round Table, Southern California, and it came out to $64 for 2 large pizzas and 1 small. What the frick? Not having a lot of clothes. I can't stand a cluttered closet, and having more than about 3 pairs of shoes seems excessive to me. Ditto. I had 4 pairs of shoes once, and I felt like I was suffocating, but they were all necessary. 1 pair for work, 1 for church, 1 for daily use, and 1 pair of gym shoes. Not filling up the gas tank because you might really need the money later. $10 at a time. Save another $10, that's food for a week just in case. There were 5 of us growing up, so we always had our good clothes and our everyday clothes. We changed out our good clothes as soon as we got home from school, and I still have this habit to this day. I changed out of my work clothes and into lounge around the house I don't care clothes as soon as I get home. The narrator does this too, but it's as much out of a desire, nay, a need to lounge on the couch in his underpants in a slovenly, disgusting fashion than any sense of self-preservation for his good clothes. Off-brand foods. So much cheaper. Love me a can of beans. If I have no dinner, no problem, I get a can of beans. They're also super healthy and food for your digestive system. You know what? I've gotten used to not having a bed frame, and I ended up using just the mattress and box spring and having old flat pillows instead of new fluffed up ones. I can sleep anywhere. Slept on the floor for a good couple of years, and I can handle heat pretty well because we didn't have AC. It was a 1-window unit until senior year. Can literally watch anything and be entertained because we only had 1 local Channel 10 station. Saying all this sounds like I grew up in the 50s, but gosh darn it, this was all in the mid-2000s. I still buy used clothes. Me too. I try to say it's because I want to be environmentally conscious, but really, I just can't bring myself to spend more than $6 on a top. I eat a lot of frozen chicken pot pies. The crust is amazing. Lots of people mix it all up. I eat the crust last, but I hate crust on actual pie. I developed a dislike of wearing new shoes. I prefer old, worn-out shoes. The new pairs feel too rigid. Even though I have the money to replace them now, I still wear the same pair of boots I brought my senior year in high school. I'm in my mid-20s now. They've been worn through every crappy job I've worked through college, and in every office job I've worked since getting my degree. Through most of my good times, hardships, and adventures, they've been what's on my feet. It's an odd thing to get attached to, but when you've had them for years and they're broken in just right, they're a tough thing to replace. Keeping all of my clothes even though I'll never wear them. I didn't have much growing up, so now I feel like I need to keep everything. A close friend grew up very poor and unsupported. Things were always a competition between him and his brothers, so he maintained that mentality into adulthood in many respects. Fast forward to us going to a Smash Bros tournament. He's egging me on while I'm playing the other people, but I'm sincerely supportive of him when he goes up for his own match. As we leave the store, he basically says, "Wow, I was a butthole to you while you were constantly cheering me on. I feel kinda bad now." He just prefers being competitive in nearly any aspect, though it's certainly gotten way calmer lately. I get freaked out if my pantry isn't full. It doesn't even matter if it's food I like, I just have this fear of not having food in the house. Not turning on the heater no matter how cold it gets, just layer up and lots of blankets. Saving every cent I can. I'm talking 80 cents for 60-cent cans of beans, and never buying actual brand name anything. Pinching pennies never seems to leave you. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Mac and cheese with tuna. Cheap, but so good. I ignore the dates on a lot of food. The milk I smell just before I use it to make sure it's not sour. Constantly checking the bread for mold when I know it's past the date. Smelling the meat before I cook it to make sure it's okay. Unless something is like 6 or more months past the date, it's usually good. The expiration is just the warning that means you have to start checking it. This shouldn't be a poor thing. Food waste is so terrible, and most of those dates are either inaccurate or mean best before, which is about quality, not edibility. And with some things, you can pick or cut off the mold, like cheese. Maybe bad fruit in a bunch, cooking it more thoroughly or cooking it early to then eat a couple of days later. Buying cheap things and making peace with the fact that they will eventually break, it may not taste good or it won't fit me, instead of investing in something long-lasting. I can't travel. I'd love to, I could probably afford to now, but dropping any amount of money on a trip seems insane to me. I grew up never really going anywhere outside of a 3-hour drive and only stayed in hotels maybe about 3 times while I was under 18. It also feels weird to be in debt, but managing it. I have medical bills that I'm paying off, and credit card stuff, but it's all pretty manageable. Growing up, my mum constantly would get payday loans, and we had bill collectors calling non-stop about medical debt, and my mum maxed out every credit card she owned. So I was taught that debt was horrible and you could never get out of it. Also, I really love microwaved tortillas and cheese as a whole meal. That and lettuce, cheese, and ranch wrapped up in a tortilla. I think back on it though, and I'm really not sure how my parents raised me with how much they made. I make double now what both my parents' combined income was when I was in high school, and I really don't even make that much. Plus-sized women. The only skinny chicks in the hood were the working girls who did smack. You know, I never considered this aspect of growing up in a rougher neighborhood. I mean, that might just be your personal taste as well. But it sure would be interesting to do a study of some sort on it based on people from different backgrounds. Leftovers are my jam. I take home friends' leftovers. I have no shame. I can find a good way to reheat just about anything. Expiration dates are like yellow lights. The concept of selling a car is entirely foreign to me. We drive cars until they die so completely that even the junkyard doesn't want to pay for them. Keeping the lights off almost all the time, or biking everywhere. Only ever buying clothes if there's a really good sale. I never just go out to buy new clothes. I like fake maple syrup better than the real stuff. I love walking everywhere. If it's within a 60-minute walk, sometimes even longer, I'm that person that will walk and wants everyone to join me for the exercise and adventure, when everyone else is begging me to take a 5 or 10-minute Lyft or Uber. Heck no! Why would I pay for something when I can get exercise and have a pleasant stroll for free? It's just so nice to walk around and see your city. My friends will pay $5 for an Uber to not walk 5 minutes in the relatively okay part of downtown LA. But I enjoy walking around and seeing the buildings, people, hot dog stands, and random YouTubers, which I would normally have missed out on had I gotten an Uber and started scrolling Instagram. Little strolls make you appreciate the little things in life. I'll start with my own. I can't stand actual quality toilet paper. I can only tolerate the cheap sandpapery thin garbage. The nice plush stuff feels gross to me. We used to eat butter bread, which is just butter on one slice of bread folded over hot dog style. Still slaps to this day, I don't care. I'm plus-sized and losing weight quickly now. I've come to believe being fat in the first place, for me, has a lot to do with never knowing if we'd have enough food from week to week. Also, I grew up with the mentality of, if it's free, take it and take as much as you can. I used to enjoy just eating a tub of saltines, with butter if I felt fancy. My parents grew up poor and we didn't rise well into the middle class until a decade into my father's career. It still shows. We always do leftovers and plan several meals around discounted food. Say a big piece of beef or turkey after the holidays. We'll have a nice meal and then eat nothing but turkey for about 2 weeks afterwards. Even now that my dad is well off, they don't buy new cars and their house is a construction project because they brought a teardown in a nice neighborhood. My siblings and I all play instruments and all our instruments are second-hand or broken pieces my dad refurbished and gave to us as our birthday or Christmas presents. We also do joint mum and dad and grandma and grandpa gifts, laptops as high school graduation presents. When I was younger, my mum used to have a coupon book and she lived by it. But after my dad started making more, she just stopped. I also remember driving and never flying, like driving clear across the US because it was cheaper than 4 tickets plus a dog. Only buying clothes to go back to school, and then finding out that in the working world, this turns into only buying clothes for a new job. I don't like giving or receiving opulent, frivolous gifts. I always feel harshly like the money should be saved or spent on something practical. Eating cold food out of a tin. Not a problem. Conversely, hot cocoa made with water. I never take anything for granted. Even though I have a good job that pays 6 figures, I always spend frugally and have ample savings and a backup plan in the event that I should become unemployed. I don't waste money on non-essentials and I try to make things last as long as possible, like cars or electronics, before I replace them. I secretly feel like anyone who orders any drink but water at a restaurant is insane. Even when my in-laws take us out, I order water because I don't want to take advantage of them. Not flushing the toilet. My dad said it was to save water. I flush water in public bathrooms, just not my own. Ugh, my dad used to do this. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to take a leak, lift the toilet lid and be confronted by the odor of his fermenting pee. I like splurging when it's for something special for someone else. I hate buying something nice that I really want for myself, and worse when someone else goes out of their way to give me something nice. Canned green beans are better than frozen or fresh green beans. Change my mind. When people use 2 to 3 paper towels to dry their hands off when it can be done with just 1 sheet, or using paper towels at all, that's what hand towels are for. Dish rags were for washing dishes and Dad's old white undershirts were cut into pieces for cleaning. Paper towels were a luxury right up there with paper plates. No spending money on stuff you're just going to throw away. Except toilet paper, thank God my parents were never too cheap for that. Thank you to our authors for once again confronting the narrator with the truly rainforest butchering amount of paper towels he goes through on a weekly basis. I've really got to tone that crap down. I grew up with some money but don't have much nowadays. My family bought an old house and renovated it. I was involved there since I was about 10 years old. And I've always been interested in crafting and woodworking and such. I learned electronics in a specialized school for 2 years until I decided to do something else. So I like doing stuff myself. I know how to fix most electronic devices, so when I want something new, I just buy it as broken off eBay or flea markets and fix it. I don't remember what I paid for this 21-inch LG screen that I'm currently looking at, but it wasn't much because it didn't work. A capacitor for less than €1 fixed it. I do woodworking and build my own furniture, some at least, preferably with wood that others don't need anymore. I always cook at home and bake my own bread. And actually, I buy cheap, but usually stuff that's good quality. My latest is an old broken drill, Metabo. I paid €1 for it and it's already running again. People just don't know how to fix things and throw everything away once it stops working. Cold hot dogs are still one of my favorite snacks. Super cheap and quick, and it's basically a bologna tube. Also, not really a preference, but I'll never touch a random dog or walk up behind one without making myself known and asking the owner if it's okay. It seems obvious, but living in LA, people will grab or let their children pet strange dogs without even asking. Growing up, every dog was seen as a guard dog until someone said otherwise. Medicine, painkillers, and doctor visits are too expensive. If it isn't sufficient to interfere with work, then you deal with it. I'm between jobs at the moment. Recently went to a minute clinic in CVS because I thought I had a blood clot. I was there for less than 5 minutes, turned out to be a large burst blood vessel. Cost me $140, and the next time I think I'll just risk dying. A Totino's pizza roll in the microwave is better than a Totino's pizza roll from the oven. Leftovers must be eaten. Food waste is not a thing in my house. If I have to throw out any food, I just think, well, that's money and a meal wasted. It makes me anxious and angry. Can't help myself though. I was starved as a child along with being poor and was homeless for a year. Food is everything. I'm not materialistic and I can't really relate to those that are. I don't send food back that is wrong unless it's disgusting. I'll eat what was given to me. I slept in my jeans because there was no heating in my childhood home until my mum remarried. I did this until I was 14 and I noticed that some of the blue denim dye had actually made my knees bluish-grey. I had to stop then. Doing a large load of laundry so I don't waste water and detergent on a smaller load. My mum used to get annoyed when we did a load but didn't fill it all the way because it wasted water. My boyfriend's mum doesn't understand why I let the hamper become full because she'll do a load that has 4 pieces of clothing in it. She basically washes whatever she wore that day the same day. Maybe she'll combine 2 days' worth of clothes. I know exactly how much I can put in the washer and have it be really full, but not so full that the clothes don't come out fully cleaned. Also, ramen. Loved ramen when I was a kid and money was tight, and I love it now. What was the most WTF thing that a customer brought into a second-hand shop? I worked at a weapons shop and a shady-looking guy brought in a few pairs of night vision goggles, like high-end military-grade PVS-14 night vision goggles. I asked him why he was selling them. Oh, I just don't need them anymore. Oh, cool, man. Do you mind if I call the company real quick and run the numbers? Sometimes this stuff is stolen property. As soon as I said that, he jumped across the counter, grabbed the goggles, and bolted for the door. A guy brought in a stack of about 15 laptops that all said, "Property of Cleveland Public High School," right on the top of each one. He then threatened to shoot me when I told him to get out. Okay, because people are asking, yes, I'm aware that schools and businesses can sometimes sell off old laptops, which is why I don't flat out call the cops when someone brings in suspected stolen items. There's always the chance that no matter how obviously stolen it is, the person owns it legitimately. However, I'm not going to risk my job or my conscience by taking an item if it has a label on it claiming it's someone else's property. Also, how am I supposed to sell a laptop that says "property of city, public schools" on it? Pawn shops have a bad enough rap as it is. I know a few guys who've run these sort of shops. One thing I've seen was a guy who brought in smoke grenades and M249 saw belts that he had stolen from our local military drill center. Another was a guy at a local weapons store who brought in a piece that had an illegal oil filter suppressor on it. They told the guy to get the frick out and go destroy that thing. A buddy of mine worked at a pawn shop for a few years. They had a guy try to sell them a police walkie-talkie, like straight stolen from a car but with the battery taken out. They told him to get effed and called the cops. I believe they picked the guy up a few hours later. This just reminded me of my friend who pawned the DSLR camera I let him borrow for a school project. I asked for it back a good amount of times and not once did he tell me what he did with it. I had to hear it from someone else and then he claimed that I gave it to him. A man brought in a bag of white snow and asked if I would buy it, then resell it back to him in a couple of days. Bold plan on the part of the seller here. Unfortunately, there's no further detail as to whether they called the cops on them, but there is a pretty funny follow-up comment. "Hey boss, this guy just sold us like 10 kilos of white snow and wants to buy it back in a few days." Weird, what's the point in exchanging 5 kilos of substances back and forth? Is this some sort of scam? I don't know. When he comes back to pick up his 2.5 kilos, we'll have to ask about that. Not an owner, but I got a call from a pawn shop saying that one of my at-home employees tried to sell her work computer. It has my company's logo and contact info right on it, plain as day. How stupid can some people be? A school security guard pawned his service weapon and other equipment. He got caught by his supervisor carrying around a pellet shooter. I knew someone once who was into some bad stuff. He didn't have his school-provided laptop at class one day, and never again after that. As it turns out, it was his, for these laptops were indeed our own personal property, even though the school, quote, gave them to us. But the thing is, what they meant by giving each student a nice free laptop was overcharging the mother effers ×2 and building it into the price of tuition, and therefore the student loan. So I had that computer for a while, and he sold his to a pawn shop. How many college students do you know who would refuse a new MacBook Pro back in 2010 that they wouldn't have to pay for until they began paying back their student loans? A guy literally brought in a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. He was doing yard work for this old lady whose husband had passed. She gave it to him for doing some yard work, not realizing it was live and active. The guy was career military, and after the bomb squad came and disabled it, they went to her house and found a trove of similarly very illegal military-grade weapons. Just a worker at one of these stores, but we had a couple come in to pawn their backhoe over the weekends. Happens a lot, and brought their bill of sale. They wanted a simple $1,000 loan, which wasn't bad considering how much it was worth. No more than 30 minutes later, cops are there with the owner. Apparently they worked for him and went and pawned all of his industrial equipment. In a similar vein, my friend found some green herb in the oven he brought from a used appliance store. The shop called him to ask about the oven. Luckily, he didn't give out his address. I literally had a customer come in and say, "Hi, I've just stolen this phone off my sister. How much will you give me for it?" Also had a customer bring in 5 MacBooks at the same time with a certain logo on it which gave me the impression they were stolen. I told him to leave them with me for testing and called the police. Had another customer bring in a gun and a crossbow. That was weird. I'm in the UK and this is not a normal thing. Story from the 90s. My Fender Stratocaster was stolen and I reported it. Couple of years passed and an officer called me. "Your guitar serial number showed up at a pawn shop." "Great, so you know who stole it." "The guy who sold it at a pawn shop said it was a present from his girlfriend, but she died." "Okay, so I get my guitar back?" "No, the pawn shop already sold it." "Don't they have to check serial numbers?" "Yeah, but that can take 30 days and we can't expect them to hold on to this stuff forever." "What? So what do I do now?" "Nothing, really." "So why are you calling me?" "I just thought you'd want to know. Bye." True story. Most stuff isn't even worth the time to report it stolen. You always got to look out for the people who bring in a crap ton of brand spanking new tools or electronics. Over time, you learn to read people based on their appearance, behavior, and personal information. An experienced broker can almost always immediately sleuth out whether they're stolen or not. In these cases, they mostly are. I've never had someone intentionally bring in illicit items, but it's important to check pockets and compartments on cases and similar things. It's not unheard of for some eclectic customer to forget about a little baggie of green herb that they'd stashed. One guy paid off his loan with cash, and there was a thin layer of white residue coating it. The first time I'd seen that one. And not illegal, but toward the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, some wisecrack nutcase did try to sell us disinfectant. Funny, but also annoying. I wonder if that last guy had acquired all of his before eBay and Amazon had stopped letting others price gorge off them. If so, double screw that guy. I had this guitar that had a little sliding door on the side, meant to hold picks. I put green herb in there as a joke. I completely forgot about it as I was selling it. They were pretty chill. Oh god, there was this one really weird guy who brought in a dead duck while hunting is illegal in my area, and also just why? Wouldn't call this illegal per se, but I feel like I have to share this. A friend of mine owns a pawn shop, and one day a guy walks in with a cardboard box filled to the top with his own number 2. He claims that it's magic, and my friend cuts him off right there and kicks him out. As he's walking out, he drops the box by accident and gets all of his crap on the floor. Sees the mess he's made, stares at the horrid pile of feces for a couple of seconds and runs out of the shop. My friend never got his name and never saw him again. The smell would proceed to linger in the shop for a good month after it was cleaned up. I was in the US Army from the early 1990s until 2014, and I knew a guy like this in about 1993 or 94. Our whole unit moved from Fort Lewis, Washington, down to Fort Polk, Louisiana. This genius goes into the little local town and gets a Radio Shack credit card because active duty military members We're pretty much immediately approved because of our guaranteed monthly income. Smart guy comes up with a great plan to buy a bunch of stuff at Radio Shack when he needed a few bucks, then take it down the road and sell it at the local pawn shop. It was all new equipment in a sealed box, so the pawn shop gave him about 15% of the retail price for everything he brought in. He just figured that after a few years, he'd be making enough money to pay off the credit card bills, or that the credit card company would just drop the charges? He was such a screw-up. He was being processed for discharge and he didn't even realize it. The last I saw, he was getting kicked out with nowhere to go afterward. I felt bad for him, but at the same time, I liked seeing him get messed over for knowingly messing over the system for so long. I was in a pawn shop when this happened. Someone brought in a wheelchair with the tag for the local hospital on the back. Example, property of somewhere hospital. The pawn shop owner told him to leave it and get out. They did, and he called the non-emergency line. The police came and picked it up and took it back to the hospital, or that's what they said they were doing anyway. A friend of mine owns a shop. One day a woman walks in and asks if there's a female employee she could talk to. No problem, it's a family shop and his 18-year-old daughter comes out to help her. She asks to go out to her car where she opens the trunk. Whole thing is packed with bedroom toys, bondage stuff, outfits and a big box of phallic items. The woman says her sister, who recently passed away, sold this stuff at parties and she had no idea what to do with it. I used to work at a pawn store. A shady guy brought in a tiger skull. I don't remember if it was illegal or not, but the owner was yelling at him. He kept coming back and bringing animal skin and skulls. I think the police substance busted his house, from what the owner told me. A friend of mine owns a rather unique store with a lot of authentic medieval weaponry, armor, clothing, and similar. While I was there, a young couple decided his shop was the place to sell a few old SS daggers, belts, flags, and other Third Reich memorabilia. Solid logic, except for one thing. We're in Germany. Here, the state kind of frowns upon either owning or selling this stuff. They could have donated it to any museum and would have had no issue with the law whatsoever. I mean, it wasn't their fault they found it, right? But they figured that if Grandpa was from that particular organization, he could at least help with the funds for the renovations and decided cash was better than being named in a museum leaflet. My friend was mostly insulted by the idea. That's just because he owns a medieval store and sells historic weapons. I mean, he must know a collector for this sort of stuff that would pay cash, but that was the end of it. He told them to get out and donate it. Or if they insist on selling it, ship it to the US. More money from history buffs, or at least not one happy little German extremist with a new happy stabby toy. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I was on the receiving end of someone selling my stolen stuff at one of these stores. We had our house burgled in the UK. Me and my dad went to some pawn shops to give them a list of everything taken. While we were in there, someone came up to the counter and started unloading a bunch of stuff they want to sell, and it was our stuff. We got into a major incident inside the shop. The jerk manager of cash converters was saying it's nothing to do with him and to take it all outside. Sorry buddy, but when you're happy to buy a camera full of someone else's family photos, a laptop, and a bunch of other electronics from two junkies who look like they're homeless, no teeth, obvious signs of substance use, among other things, then it's absolutely 100% your problem to deal with. The police were called, junkies charged with handling stolen goods, and I got charged with attacking them. That was later dropped. Nobody charged with the actual burglary, so no real punishments for anyone involved. I don't know if it's necessarily illegal, but one time a guy brought me a handful of human teeth with bloody roots and gold fillings. He wanted me to extract the gold. I said, no thanks, bro. Even as a guy who works on a channel where we read objectively bat-crap crazy stuff all the time, I have to admit this one was a bit of a shock. So do people just think that all people who work at these shops are criminal fences or something? An MP40. Not actually me, but my significant other. He manages a store owned by a national chain. He brought it in on pawn, and as with all neat things, he was just waiting for the loan to drop after the 30 days of payment before the item went out on sale. At this point, he could purchase it. Now, I'm not a huge weapon historian, but I know the era and style and had to ask, that thing is super rare if it's not full auto. When a weapon is taken in on loan, the weapon is run, not the person, so our state's Bureau of Investigation was notified of its existence. Not only is a federal stamp for automatic weapons expensive as frick, it's also difficult to obtain, so he was no longer going to purchase it. And it's a good thing, because shortly after, the gun was seized by ATF, which is when we found out the actual worth, $10,000 to $20,000. Original owner brought it back as a war trophy, and the son is the one who got a loan, for like $200, but it was never registered, so it was contraband. I don't like pawn shops. My buddy had his surfboard stolen. A few weeks later, he found his board in a pawn shop. My buddy approached the staff and said it was his and that it was stolen. The staff then told him he had to buy the board back if he wanted it. The police were called because the board was reported stolen. Upon the arrival of the police, my buddy learned he still had to buy back the board if he wanted it back and then file a claim with the state to get his money back. Why does the state cover pawn shops selling stolen goods? Really nice old-looking farmer man walks in with a shotty with a barrel way too short. Long story short, boss brought it off him and immediately called the local police department to tell them. The cop asked if you could just remove the barrel and dispose of it as it was too much paperwork and hassle to come down and get it. The local police department are a fricking joke. A TV was stolen from my dad's office and sold to a pawn shop. This had been happening with yard decorations and our neighbors told us what pawn shop to look at. Sure enough, it showed up, and at first the manager wouldn't provide any info or even care that we thought it was stolen. My dad then offered to buy it and requested that the TV be plugged in to check for defects. It worked just fine, and my dad said he'll take it, and then pulled the remote out of his pocket that the thief didn't take and turned the TV off, proving it was his. The manager then had to call and report this. Turns out accepting a TV without a remote is a red flag that he missed in this case. The manager quit, but the general belief was that he knew most of the stuff he was selling was stolen, but he fudged paperwork to keep the thief's identity a secret. My dad put him in his place and humiliated him in the most simple way for being a lying prick. My friend's dad works at a pawn shop in a crappy area and has had some crazy stuff come in, mostly stolen weapons and tools, but the story he likes to tell is when a homeless guy tried to sell a sawn-off shotty covered in tape. They called the cops and the guy tells him he found it in the park. A block away from my high school was a pawn shop. It was announced that everyone in the entire school was going to get a Chromebook to do some schoolwork. On the first day that we got the Chromebooks, it was rumored that multiple people had brought them to the pawn shop to make a quick buck. I asked my teachers who was in charge of all the Chromebook repairs about this later, and he said that only one student had actually done it that he knew of, and he used the money to buy green herb. When my first fiancée and I parted ways, I went to go sell my ring. She'd given me her ring back, so I went to pawn them because I was broke and I got so many dirty looks for selling an engagement ring. I think they thought I stole it despite what I told them, but them's the breaks, I suppose. One of the guys who worked at the place told me that someone brought in an F-box, a decent-sized box that has a switch on it that turns on a motor inside that has a connection to a toy that thrusts in and out of a hole. I saw a guy in my local store bring in about 3 automatic weapons with the ammo and about 10 grenades, ready to use. Not sure if it was illegal or not, but it made my antique Hot Wheels collection look like crap. I work in a store. Not really illegal in itself, but probably the most contact with law enforcement that I've had. I live in the UK where we have to put the serial number of any technology through a police check before paying the customer. We put it in and it flagged as wanted by the police. Within 10 minutes the police were there and asking us to hand the phone over and talk to the guy. We hadn't even gotten through to them yet on the phone. From what I understand, the guy brought it online a few months back. Unfortunately for him, the phone was wanted in connection with a murder. The look on that poor guy's face. That is a really unlucky eBay case that my dude there got himself. Don't you hate it when you try to be thrifty and end up being taken down to the station for an intense questioning and then they keep your damn phone? My house was broken into years back. They stole very particular items. My mum's laptop, which was hidden under the couch, our great-grandmother's jewelry and such. My laptop, Wacom pen tablet, and iPad were all sitting on the kitchen table, and the only thing they took was my iPad and the pen to my Wacom tablet. They left my laptop and the tablet itself. Remember these points for later. The cops couldn't find any good prints to run through the database, and no one was immediately found as a suspect. Fast forward a few months, my brother manages one of the biggest pawn shops in our city, and he called me to tell me that some guy just tried to pawn my iPad. The guy handed the iPad to my brother turned it on, and the home screen is set to a picture of me and my nephew. Brother tells the guy that he has to take it to the back and check the serial numbers after getting the guy's driver's license. Brother calls the cops and then comes back out to tell the guy that he has to keep the iPad because it's stolen property. The guy books it out of there, but he wasn't very bright. My brother has all of his personal information. The cops did an investigation and come to find out this guy is the head of a large substance and theft ring. His cronies steal things and they have to give him the stolen goods, and then he gives them the substances. Well, a few more months go by and we found out that our mum's best friend's boyfriend was the guy who put the hit on our house. He had an oxy problem due to a bad back surgery and a substance-dealing doctor. When the doc cut the supply, he turned to other means. It wasn't him that broke in or stole our stuff, however. He just knew that I used my computer for my job and made sure they left my laptop and stole my mum's. He and his boss, along with multiple other addicts and career thieves, were brought down by my iPad. The cops said they'd broken into an estimated 300-plus homes and had stolen millions of dollars in property. I work in one, and honestly, you just never know what's going to come through that door. Former employee. The most illegal thing brought to my shop was an 8-ball of white snow. He wasn't selling it but wanted to buy a digital scale, and he brought the ball along just to test the scales we had. Aside from that, a chainsaw. Although not illegal in itself, they used it to threaten me, which was pretty illegal. Pawn shops in a big metro get pretty crazy. I had this street rat named Tintin bring in a purse with fresh bloodstains on it. I used to work in a pawn shop that was just for tools. This guy brought in these really nice top-of-the-line wrenches to sell. He said business was booming, and I asked what he did, and he said, "You really want to know?" In a scared kind of way. I was like, "Yeah, I'm just making small talk," and he said he was a substance dealer. So I said I don't want the wrenches, they were probably stolen. I used to work in an electronics or DVDs games secondhand store, and we used to get people in all the time selling what were blatantly mass-run bootlegs. Hundreds of copies of the same DVD, which under even rudimentary inspection didn't come off a proper print run. Heck, if you popped one in a player, it usually just cut right into the movie a few seconds in or something like that. That and people who had just stolen crap from a first-hand retailer nearby and were busy tearing the packaging off in the damn queue for the registers. One of my friends in high school somehow managed to steal several laptops from cash converters. Got away with it too. That was until they tried to sell one of the laptops they stole back to cash converters the very next week, with the CC sticker and barcode still on the bottom. He was quickly caught and they found his whole stash, and he did 100 hours of community service. What is the funniest answer to a test when the student clearly didn't know the answer? I graded AP exams this summer. For one essay question, I got an awesome barbecue sauce recipe from a kid in Tennessee. I've made that a couple of times, and it's excellent. I was marking a final year engineering test. I'm a teacher's assistant, not a lecturer. And instead of answering the last question, some guy drew an incredibly detailed portrait of himself serving fries at McDonald's with the caption, "Me if I fail this test." I still had to fail him, but I did feel bad about it. Some say he's serving fries to this day. It wasn't for a test, but a large portion of the class didn't do an assignment, so the teacher decided to assign a makeup assignment. He wasn't planning on assigning anything, so he asked the class for ideas. Someone said, "An essay about procrastination," and he said, "I like that idea," and the conversation ended with that. Next class rolls around and someone turns in an essay titled, "The Importance of Effective Communication," because he never actually assigned the essay. It was a pass or fail class, so the essay was pretty much a completion grade. The teacher accepted it and gave him a warning that if he tried that in any other class, he might have gotten a 0. I was helping a teacher grade back in high school, and I was grading a kid's geometry quiz. The question was a 2-column proof, and it asked to prove that one side was congruent to another based off 2 triangles being congruent. Had to prove that the 2 triangles were congruent first. This was his whole answer. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle BCD because they kinda look the same. Side AB equals side DB because they're both 3 eraser lengths long. College-level physics exam asked for a brief description of Maxwell's theory. The instructor shamed a student by reading aloud his answer. Good to the last drop. Just another student. We had a test which involved life skills. The question was, what are 2 causes of infertility in males? His response was lack of a wang. He tried to argue that he wasn't wrong and somehow got a mark. I don't know if the teacher survived that debate with a straight face, but I know for a fact that I wouldn't have been able to. Sorry students, this is what happens when you go for the low-hanging fruit. No pun intended. My friend needed to name Alga Hiss on his government exam. He forgot the dude's name, so he put I am not a spy. Back in college, if I vaguely knew the word I needed to answer, like Alga Hiss, I'd write out the A very clearly and then scribble next to it so it looked like I knew the answer and just had crappy handwriting. It worked extremely well. As a teacher's assistant in my high school grading chemistry tests, for one question, which read, convert 1 meter into millimeters, one student had converted meters to yards to feet to inches to centimeters to millimeters, rather than just multiply by 1,000. My high school teacher would always encourage us to write funny answers down if we didn't know anything. She found marking tests extremely boring, so if we could make her laugh, we'd at least get 0.5 of a mark on it. The student actually knew the answer, he just didn't know how to spell it. I taught history and showed a video clip of Ronald Reagan's famous, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." In a later quiz, I asked students to write down this quote, with my favorite response starting, "Mr. Gooberchuck." I had one ESL student who couldn't quite get the hang of changing singular nouns into plurals. I have a pen got him full marks on the unit test. I have 2 pen and added an IS at the end of the word pen didn't get him full marks. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that Double Sausage Dude just has really crappy grammar. It wasn't an answer, it was a proposition. Saw a post on Reddit where someone drew a picture and got credit for it for a test answer. So I did the same thing on my next science test. Teach told me that my drawing of a giraffe was garbage and gave me nothing. I was a student teaching 1st grade and was quizzing a student on sight words. The word was horse, and he said, "Whores, whores, whores!" I'm a teacher that hasn't got any super funny answers yet, but when I was a student, my philosophy class did a group thing about a test. Our professor had told us that at the start of the quarter, that when we did the final, if every single person turned in the test that's blank except for a name, we'd all get an A. Apparently, he made this offer to every class for years. Well, of the 20 or so of us in the class, only 1 person was going to pass. We all thought the teacher was a jerk. So when it came time for the final, he passed out the test and left to go to his office. After he was gone, we all talked about it, and those of us who had bad grades said, "We have nothing to lose by turning in a blank paper. We're failing anyway." And then we looked at the one guy who was passing. He said, "I'm a philosophy major, so I just want to find out if he means it or not. Let's do it." So we all wrote down our names on our individual tests. Then we lined up and went to his office and one by one handed him our blank tests. He was shocked. We were the first class to pull it off. He made us promise not to tell anyone, and he did give us all 100% on the final. I clearly didn't keep my promise about not talking about it. One time, a kid in my Latin class started sneezing out various denominations of bills when turning in his test. The total added up to $75. I think he dropped the class. When my wife and I were TAs in grad school, we proctored and then graded an essay exam. We had a student write, "I don't know, so here's a picture of a puppy," and he then drew a beautiful picture of a puppy. It took him nearly an hour to complete it. To this day, when I ask my wife a question and she doesn't know the answer, she just says, "puppy." Well, I'm not a grader, but I've got one. An old teacher of mine used to grade AP stats tests, and he said a student once drew an elaborate Rube Goldberg chain reaction kind of thing across 2 pages for a short answer. Not me, but a classmate of mine. In my 8th grade social studies class, the teacher offhandedly mentioned, "Necessity is the mother of invention." On the test, one question was, "Blank is the mother of blank." My classmate wrote, "Mary is the mother of Jesus," and we were all really upset that he didn't get the credit. 8th grade free response question, explain how the United States acquired the Louisiana Purchase. My answer? The United States purchased Louisiana. I received full credit. Well, to be fair to you, it was a stupidly worded question. What else were you going to say? Napoleon was like, oh my god, we need those dollar bills. And then Jefferson was like, but seriously, it's not in the Constitution that I can buy stuff like that. And then Jefferson's cabinet was like, stop being a jerk and buy it. And then Jefferson was like, "K." I mean, your teacher just wrote the worst question ever. I had a friend who put Obama is a lizard as an answer to all of the AP Gov-free response questions. The narrator feels like, given what he's learned about certain parts of the US, you might be able to get a partial credit on that answer depending on which deep red state you did that in. Got to teach a technical theatre class and gave a quiz at the beginning to see what the kids knew. One of the questions was, name a good conductor. I was looking for metal conductor like copper or brass, ended up with several answers like Leopold Stokowski, Leonard Bernstein, and several famous composers. We all had a good laugh when we went over the answers. A bit different, not quite a test. Class was reading a play in English literature during junior year. We were rotating parts between students through the various acts, point being that we did actually have parts, so people weren't necessarily focusing on the story as much as they were on when it was going to be their turn to speak. Some girl's line comes up and her character is mentally handicapped. The line read, make horse sounds, with horse being spelt Hoarse, as in raspy throat. The student started to neigh. I don't know about credit, but we all had a good laugh. On a sample essay I read for AP World History, they were listing evidence for a question related to American Indians. One kid wiped his blood on the exam sheet and wrote, "This is a blood sacrifice to the sun god of the Incas." Sadly, he didn't get the credit. I took a philosophy class in high school. For the final paper, we had the option to write an essay arguing to the teacher that we were not a figment of his imagination. I decided to do the opposite. I wrote a whole essay about how I was a figment of my teacher's imagination, and I ended up with a B in the course. That was the only assignment I handed in for the entire course. When I was a sophomore in high school, I was in a biology class, and the very first test I was clueless. At this point in time, I didn't quite know the teacher or his style or anything about him, really. So naturally, clueless on the essay question, I decided to go meta and write a speech about how I was bombing the test. I compared it to Harry Truman deciding to nuke Japan, and how that was thought to have saved lives. By my own nuking of the test, who knows, maybe I could do the same. I got a call from my mum later on. He didn't like it. In fact, he decided to interpret it as a bomb threat. Needless to say, that was a rough semester afterwards. I was one of the last classes to take a hotly contested, statewide standardized exam. In its dying days, some big muckety-muck decided it would be a great idea to add a science portion to the exam. Their mistake was telling my class that we were the first class to take it, and therefore were simply testing if it was useful for the school board, and our results on that section would have no bearing on our final test results. The question was something like, Susie and John have a heavy box. They need to put the heavy box on a shelf, but it's too heavy. They have several pieces of wood, a saw, a pulley, etc., etc. Design a system for moving a box to the shelf and explain why this works in scientific terms. My response? Susie and John could do many things. They could build a lever, as you're obviously suggesting they do with the boards, but the box would likely slide back down the lever and kill Susie and John. Here is a drawing of Susie and John dead under a box. They could build a pulley, but I don't want to explain how that works, and also, if they're too small to reach the shelf with the box, how the frick are they going to attach a pulley to the roof? Drawing of Susie and John looking sad as their parents yell at them for screwing around with the garage ceiling. My recommendation is that Susie and John open the fricking box and move everything individually like normal human beings. Picture of Susie and John high-fiving and saying, "Gee, Willy Walkers, we did it!" Since the test was unscored, I never found out how they liked my solution, but I do hope I gave some old ladies a few conniption fits. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Not exactly an answer to the prompt, but at my high school, thanks to a friend, we now have the AP Stats Challenge. Get 5 on the test while writing the entire free response portion in haikus, and only haikus. So I think 5 to 10 people have pulled it off, and it definitely made the test a lot more entertaining for me. Not a teacher, but in AP Physics 2 on a practice test, so naturally I didn't care as much. When asked to solve for the mass defect, I explained how mass effect drives work in great detail, as well as different uses. I think my teacher liked it because he wrote, "This is my favorite store on the Citadel," instead of marking it wrong. Not a grader, but on the AP exam for world history, a friend of mine, rather than actually write an essay on one of the assigned topics, described the plot of Mulan. That's my second favorite story involving her. Purposefully easy extra credit question asked, "Who's your favorite founding father and why is it Alexander Hamilton?" I responded with Aaron Burr and drew a short stick figure montage of their famous duel. I knew the answer but decided to be flippant regardless. I still got full points. Once on an endocrinology exam I was sitting, the last question required everyone to reference 5 RCTs published in a journal in APA format. No one had been told that anything like this would be on their exam, and obviously no one was going to remember all the authors of a study off the top of their heads. So being my frustrated self, I referenced How to Be an Absolute B-Word by lecturer's name. 2 weeks later, I got called into her office and was made to apologize and told to not do this again. I love the sass on display here. Also, is the teacher's ego so fragile that they wanted to officially reprimand a student for writing an answer in a private setting that only the grader would see? I get that it's disrespectful, but honestly, who is so butthurt by that they go to the hassle of arranging a formal disciplining session? I am the student in this case. I'm taking AP Calculus and it's absolutely kicking my butt. When I didn't know an answer, I wrote a prayer to the god of math. O Lord of math, grant me thy favor, that I may understand this thy holy work, for I am yet powerless before your tests, and weak in my calculations. Amen. I got a half credit. On my AP Calc test last year, there was one question that I had no idea what the frick they were even asking. After staring at it for about 10 minutes, I gave up and drew a portrait of the proctor surrounded by velociraptors and climbing up a rope from a helicopter. I like to think I got at least partial credit for that. I was taking a film history and appreciation class at college and came across this question. What is camera obscura? My answer was, the type of camera a hipster uses. I got no points, but my professor said he got a good laugh out of it. Biochemistry exam. There was a complicated synthesis question. How would you produce X? And the student answered, with blood magic. The answer was written in his blood. I asked about it later. The student had gotten a paper cut when taking the test, apparently. Test included reading a map of Rome and finding your way around using coordinates. Question: how can you get to the Colosseum from the starting point? Plot out a route on the grid provided. My answer: I don't need the grid because I've played Assassin's Creed Brotherhood enough to know where I'm going. Question: who was Genghis Khan? Answer: the host of The Price is Right from about 300 AD to 350 AD. Back in the 3rd grade, I had a 2-part written question on a science test. Part 1. If you had to change the gas nitrogen to a liquid, how would you do it? My answer: I would change it to a liquid. Part 2. Explain what would happen. My answer: it would change to a liquid. Funny thing is, I actually got full credit. My teacher wrote something like, I can't say that this is what I was looking for, but I can't say that it's wrong either. Not a teacher, but when I was in high school, I had an essay exam about a book I hadn't read. Instead of answering the question, I wrote an essay about why I didn't read the book and talked about another book I'd read instead. My teacher ended up liking it and gave me a good grade, even though I hadn't read the book he assigned. I guess he liked that I put effort into writing an essay about a book I'd actually read instead of trying to bullcrap him. Question: what is X? Answer: it's certainly not Y. Question: state the differential and integral form of Hooke's law. Answer: the differential and integral form of Hooke's law. I got a full credit on each of these masterpieces. I had to read Heart of Darkness in high school. I literally couldn't get more than 3 pages into it. We had to write an essay in class about it, so I pretty much wrote, there's a man on a boat, and he's recounting a tale that took place in Africa. I make it 3 pages in and realize that I haven't actually comprehended more than the first paragraph. So I start over, there's a man on a boat, and just repeated that for a page. Then we had to read our essays aloud, and luckily we were in the AP class, so the teacher let us get away with crap. Also, had to do the same thing with All the King's Men, and I wrote about the repulsive writing style. There's a car on a road and it's driving down the road, and it's about to go off the road. And there's an N-word in the field by the road, but the N-word doesn't see the car, and the car doesn't see him, and it's about to go off the road, but they don't see each other. This is a terrible book. The narrator hasn't read All the King's Men and is not sure that this succinct summary will be enough to sway them over to doing so. Let him know in the comments if it's worth picking up. On a quiz in Bio 2, it asked what group a certain organism was in. I didn't know, so I put Blue Man Group. My TA apparently liked it because I got the point anyway. When I was in American history in high school, I had a test where one of the questions was asking what the 19th Amendment was. It was the women's right to vote, by the way. My teacher was male, and I was just screwing around and thought I'd try to make him laugh. So for the answer, I put a mistake. Ended up getting 100% on that test. I got one from both sides of the spectrum. Once in advanced calculus, the final question was something which I had no clue how to answer. So I just wrote in the entire space, 7. It turned out 7 was the correct answer. However, I got no credit for it for not showing any working. And when I was a marker at university, I was going through the tests and a question was accounting. Describe a transaction which causes a decrease in an asset and also equity. A student's answer was, a building caught on fire and got destroyed. Technically, he was correct, although it wasn't really a transaction, more of an event. Question: what are your opinions on doing the deed before marriage? 16 marks. Answer: I wouldn't buy a car before test driving it. How are you even graded on this? It's asking your opinion. Even not answering could be taken as meaning you're indifferent. In 12th grade, me and a buddy of mine, let's call him Tom, were both in the same calculus and vectors class. I already decided to major in history at a university, so my mark in this class didn't mean too much to me. Anyways, during the exam, I got to a question which asked me to graph the derivative of a given function. Not knowing what it was, I simply drew a kitty face on the graph, cause screw it, and moved on. About 10 minutes later, Tom, who was sitting beside me, discreetly got my attention, and I see he's stuck on that same problem, and hoping I'll help him out. Chuckling to myself, I turned to the question on my exam and moved it over slightly. Seeing what I'd done, Tom shook his head, quietly whispered, "Screw it," and did the same thing. Suffice to say, our teacher was less than happy with us after the exam. In high school, I was in biology class with a buddy of mine. The class and the teacher were a complete joke and no one took it seriously. On an exam, the teacher wanted an essay on something, and my buddy didn't feel like writing it. Instead, he drew a picture of Jesus and wrote, "Jesus is always the answer," above it. He received full credit. If my English teacher is on Reddit and sees this, she'll probably use my answer. We had a scarlet letter quiz and had to connect the term antimonian to the novel. I got it in my head that antimony was a woman in a Greek myth who was punished for adultery like Hester. I was the student. Spelling test. Asked to spell euthanasia. My answer was youth in Asia, the 3 words jammed together. On my English 1 last year, on one essay I wrote the names of 150 NFL football players. I got a 4. University. I dropped Chem 2 lecture, but still had to take the corresponding lab because of drop limits. Didn't get most of the material, but didn't particularly care if I failed because it was only 1 credit anyway. I drew Pokemon for all the answers on the final. I got an A. The professor was a cool guy. On the last day of class, someone brought in a big flan, another girl brought a guitar, we had a mini party, and the professor played the guitar for us. What is the most unethical thing you've been asked to do at work? I worked at a well-known automotive garage chain. I quit on my second day on the job because while I was doing an oil change, my manager told me to take out the customer's air filter, rub it on the ground outside and show it to the customer so they believe it needs to be changed. As a customer, I changed an air filter myself an hour before I took it in for an oil change, and I was suggested to replace it because it was dirty. I showed them the receipt, and they said, "Well, the entire system makes it dirty, you see." I was asked to ignore 15 open 50-gallon drums that were filled with used phosphoric acid sitting out back of a workshop next to a stream. In the middle of a city, heavy rains and hurricane winds tipped a few over one night, The boss dumped one out on the ground because he needed the drum. When I quit, I called the city on their butts. I used to work in event management and was asked to ignore fire safety violations on a regular basis. One time we hosted a funeral for a sort of local celebrity with about 3,500 people in attendance, at a venue that was licensed for 300. It was frighteningly obvious that any sort of mass panic would be absolutely disastrous, so the two staff members decided to go behind management's back and call the police. Another time, the boss at a venue refused to repair a broken heater in the middle of winter, with outside temperatures being well below freezing. He told the staff to simply use the gas oven to heat. CO poisoning is a big risk, especially since this is an industrial-strength oven meant for professional catering we're talking about. Where I am, it's illegal to operate an oven like that without a suitable ventilation system in place, which would have needed to be turned off in order to heat the place up. I'm in IT. I was asked by an executive to delete very incriminating emails he had sent to an innocent receptionist from our Exchange server. He thought they were private and she was talking about suing. He sent this request over email. I sent it to our HR and investigative units. Anytime there's a firefight or shooting incident in a war zone, afterwards you routinely have to fill out sworn statements as to how the events went down, who shot whom, etc. Let's just say there's a lot of top-down pressure and coaching beforehand, and nobody fills those out truthfully. That's simultaneously shocking and not surprising at all. That's how armies maintain the appearance that they're the good guys in any given engagement, maintain the appearance of competence to their superiors, and try to sweep friendly fire cases like Pat Tillman under the rug. Pretty shifty. I worked graveyard shift at a gas station. The owner came in under the influence one night and we were chatting. We talked about benign things and I mentioned that I just found out I was pregnant. The first thing he said was, "Good, then I wouldn't have to use protection." I was so taken back that I didn't say anything. He went on to ask me if I had tattoos in any place that he couldn't see. Then he commented on my necklace. It had tiny handcuffs on it. He asked if that's how I liked it, handcuffed. After all that and me refusing his requests politely, he said, "How much money do I have to get out of the ATM to have you tonight?" My response was he'd better go home to his wife and kids before I called them to let them know where he was. He threatened to fire me. The next day, my manager pulls me aside and asks what happened. Then he asked if I would just keep it to myself. I told him he would if he'd take me off graveyard shifts. That's how I got to keep my job and work better hours. I could make a list, but we'd be here a while. I used to work in a senior home which claimed to be independent living for the extraordinarily wealthy kind of old people. And let me tell you, that place was a prison. Kitchen was regularly below health standards and the place was a gosh darn rip-off for our residents. Our boss's stepmom moved in and was unable to move, and liability-wise we weren't able to help her with anything. However, boss would make an exception calling it above and beyond care. Screw that, if she fell we all knew our butts were on the line. Also, illegal petty cash boxes and hundreds of off-the-book expenses for the boss. My buddy used to keep the books there and he actually gave up on asking how much he was doing that was illegal. Be very careful about what senior homes you send your loved ones to, people. Not me personally, however, I was an assistant manager of a sports bar a few months ago. The owner's son and general manager of my store allowed an 18-year-old to serve booze. 19 is the minimum in my state, and she failed to card and served an underage person who got in a wreck. That person's car was totaled and she sustained severe injuries but lived. The owner's son called the other girl who was working on that shift, who was of legal age, and told her verbatim, "I want you to go home and practice saying in the mirror, 'I was your server and I carded you.'" She thought she had no option but to go along with it, and I had to be the one to tell the server what her boss was asking to do was commit perjury, and that if she did it, she'd go to jail, have a record, and wouldn't be able to so much as get a job at Walmart when she got out. Screw that guy for trying to ruin another person's life because he made a horrible mistake. The manager wanted me to clean the bathrooms, but he was being kinda weird, so I said no. Turns out a homeless person had smeared crap and blood all over the walls. I told him later he was required to get a hazmat team to take care of that. I'm not risking getting any number of diseases. He just got some other rube to do it. Similar thing happened to my friend at Macca's, except I'm pretty sure it wasn't a homeless person. She was only 14 and the manager refused to even give her gloves. Another older employee threatened to get him fired if he tried to make anyone else clean the bathroom without following procedure. He backed down, but the woman got him fired anyway because he was a power-hungry craphead who liked to use his position to get the younger employees to do questionable stuff. The amount of factory managers that want the light curtains, area scanners, and other safety features disabled on their machines in the name of speeding up production is pretty appalling. That crap's there for a reason, and if I disable it, my butt is on the line if or when your employee gets killed. I work in documentary production, and part of my job is to do annotated scripts for big international networks. I'm sure a lot of people here watch them. This is where you'll have to give references for every single line in your script to prove to the network that what you've written is 100% factual. There was a line written by the scriptwriter and director that was not quite factual due to the way it was worded. I suggested the line be reworded, but he was adamant to have it that way. So of course the network came back to us and said either change the line or find a more concrete source. I searched and couldn't find a source backing it up because of course the line wasn't factual. The director asked me to make nice with one of the experts in the topic and have him sign off on the line as a fact. I refused to do it, but the director went ahead and did it himself, and the line made it into the final film. I get very frustrated every time I see the film on TV and hear the line. When I worked in manufacturing, I would get sent into places inside running machinery because I was small and had small hands. Many of those spots were also for confined space trained people, which I was not. If you hesitated, they would scream at you from behind, which is super helpful in a confined space when you're trying not to lose your fingers in a belt. Oh, and I made $8 an hour with no benefits. No wonder they sent all those jobs to China. This was early 2000s in Wisconsin. I was a temp making pots and pans on the third shift. My boss was useless and a butthole. He ended up getting demoted to a regular worker, but was too lazy to keep up, so he was fired eventually. I did keep all my fingers, but I almost lost my scalp once. My hair got caught under a running belt. Luckily, I thought fast and grabbed my ponytail and let it take a chunk of hair instead of the whole thing. It was crappy, but I've since learned that you shouldn't do something just because someone in authority tells you to. Thank goodness that the author specified they worked in the 2000s in Wisconsin, because otherwise the narrator would have assumed from this story that they were working in a Victorian mill in old London, back when sending people into moving machinery blades was the norm. I got told to cut an employee's hours, so he dropped to part-time status. That way, the company, more accurately that store in particular, wouldn't have to pay the cost of his insurance. He had recently just got back from having major colon surgery and was deemed a risk. The worst part was I needed this guy to work full-time in department, and I had a whole team of people itching to take vacation since we worked the holidays short-handed. Anyways, joke was on the company. Immediately after I was told to do this, I reached out to a rival company and jumped ship within 2 to 3 weeks. They ended up having to give surgery guy hours once I left. I haven't personally been asked to do anything illegal, but I work at a workers' comp insurance company. The amount of employers who won't report employee injuries is staggering. I've had family members call, sobbing and begging for us to pay medical bills for injuries that occurred at work, but they can't report the claim, so there's nothing we can do. We have employers who tell their employees that it's too late to report, and they think they're just crap out of luck. Guys, if you ever get injured at work, it has to be reported. There's no such thing as too late. Your claim needs to be reported. I used to work in construction as a fire protection services inspector. I'd say I was asked to ignore something dangerous about 1 out of every 3 sites. They also thought nothing of asking me to ignore it like someone else has before. I'm talking about things like an entire sprinkler system not actually being connected in a brand new building, or fire exits that don't exist. How about alarm systems that evacuate the wrong floor when smoke is detected? Apparently, I was a B-word for refusing to issue a fire safety certificate until errors like this were fixed. Things that usually take about an hour to fix, which I was happy to wait and watch them do. I was asked to sleep with the health inspector to get us a pass. Cheap motel. A lot of sketchy things, including but not limited to working girls, gambling, bending of the liquor license. All these went on there, but I worked the front desk and was told, "If any ethnic people want a room, tell them we're full." I did not comply, and 1 or 2 times I was confronted and I just said, I didn't notice they were ethnic. I lasted 6 months there. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Years ago, I was working at a local pharmacy. The owner had always seemed like a revenue above all else kind of guy, often ranting at us pharmacy technicians about not making enough money. One day we had a patient come in with a prescription for an expensive medicine. So I tried to fill the prescription, but I noticed that our inventory for this rarely filled medicine was expired. I was filling out forms for new inventory when the owner saw what I was doing and told me to fill the prescription with the expired stuff. I tried to explain, but he silenced me with a glare. I looked to my co-workers for support, but they averted their glances. I ended up filling the prescription, but to this day I feel ashamed for not taking a stand against it. I quit the job a week later. I got asked to lie to customers, repeatedly, although this was a sales role, so it was more or less par for the course. If we worked over 40 hours, we wouldn't get time and a half, but we would get that money in an envelope in cash with no taxes taken out. So it sort of worked out. That's not legal. We would get a lot of stray cat dumps, and as you can imagine, it's very costly, but we did it anyway because you can't run an animal hospital and not love animals. Cats don't have Amex cards. Some strays were not very adoptable. We had a senior cat on a lot of meds that suffered seizures, and a weirdo wire-haired chihuahua that took a very long time to warm up to people. She bit, but had no teeth. And a house cat that had feline transmissible diseases. We had them for years. The pets, not the disease. The owner was bought out by a corporation. The first thing the corp wanted to do was bring all of the strays, even the residents, to the Humane Society. We fricking rioted. It took them a year to get them out one by one without causing too much upset, but I tell you this, none of them went to a shelter. I worked at a medical practice and the doctor would just throw medical waste and bags of used needles in the dumpster out back, instead of properly disposing of it. I still don't understand why. He could have lost his license and got slapped with thousands of dollars in fines. Just goes to show, even if you graduated from Columbia Medical School, you can still be a total fricking idiot. Not me, but my dad was asked to commit fraud in order to keep the company he was working for afloat. Ended up doing it and accumulating $16 million in fraud over the course of more than 10 years. And yes, he was jailed. He cooperated with the feds though, so he got less time. It would suck if I blew that secret on the internet. Folks, if a high-ranking boss ever asks you to do this, get them to sign an order or send an email detailing what they'd like you to do, and then immediately take it into the IRS or the equivalent. They're willing to get you sent to jail to keep their business afloat, so return the favor. I worked for a packaging company that made the pop-top caps for bottled water. They asked me to investigate altering the design of their caps so that it couldn't be reused. The idea or scheme was that if they invented a pop cap that would pop up but not back down again, they could market it to the bottled water companies as something that would force people to drink their product in a single sitting, and therefore be more likely to purchase another one later in the day, and prevent people from refilling the bottle from the tap because the lid would never close again. It was only half-heartedly thrown out there at a meeting, but everyone looked a bit uncomfortable about it and luckily it wasn't pursued. Which is just as well because as someone who thinks that bottled water is a rip-off and bottled water companies are wasting crap loads of plastic, I would not have been happy about working on that project. Working at a bar and restaurant, yeah, just cut the mold off those strawberries. Do it quick, we need them for the daiquiris. Followed sometime later by, you're cutting too much off. I was asked not to hire black people or out-of-shape people. Safe to say, I quit not long after that. Perform tasks I wasn't authorized for at all. I'm CNA and I can't tell you how many times a family member of a patient has demanded that we do the nurse's work or the physical therapist's work. Some of it I knew how to do in basic, but if I would have gotten it wrong and hurt my patient, it would have been on me. I was asked to blame a client team member for a mistake I made as there was a financial implication to my company if it was one of our team members who was at fault. I didn't consider doing that once though. I went above the person who asked me and told him it was my fault, and I think it actually worked out to my benefit long term. As a manager, I was asked to tell my 16-year-old co-worker that he wasn't allowed to drink water while he was working the fryer in the summer because a customer saw him taking a sip and said it, quote, upset her. Yeah, safe to say I didn't repeat that order. Someone asked me to remove the password from their deceased daughter's laptop so they could see if there were any pictures on it. Apparently the daughter had tried to rescue her boyfriend who'd been dragged out to sea. Neither could swim and both drowned. I'm my own boss, so nobody made me, but boy was it an ethical conundrum. I've been in similar situations. What I do is unlock it privately, make sure there's nothing overtly damaging to their memory, like racy pictures or documents on how to kill people, and then give it back to them. It means so much to someone who lost someone they love to get pictures back. Plus, you can do someone who's gone a solid and protect their memory. That's really awesome of you. My best friend, who often watches these videos, hi Jay, has been instructed to completely destroy my phone and delete a specific folder on my computer. I'm not a bad person, but there's a lot of old conversations or journal writings or photos that I like to have for myself, but I would never want my daughter to find them. Huh. I was asked to schedule my bathroom breaks as I was going to the bathroom too many times during the day. When I was asked to write advertising copy for homeopathic children's medicines. Oh, and fluoride-free toothpaste, which does jack all to protect teeth. Background: busy fast food restaurant right at the end of the lunch rush. There was some bread sitting on the counter and my manager asked me to put it in the cabinet where it went. As I was putting it away, a customer came up to me and said, "Excuse me, but that bread was on the floor and someone picked it up and set it on the counter." I apologized and moved it back out of the cabinet and asked my manager about it just in case the customer was confused or something else. Her response? "Oh, just wait for the customer to leave and put it away once they're gone." Nope. I'm sure there have been worse things, but I recently left my job as a barista. There were a handful of times when we dealt with an offensive customer and I was asked by another barista to decaf their drink. I never did. The thought offended me even more because I take a lot of pride from my work ethic. Besides, I didn't want to lower myself to how a customer treats us, and it's not like I knew what they'd been going through either. Well done to you, you're a much more considerate and honorable person than the narrator. Personally, whenever I had customers like this, the only thing stopping me from pulling crap like decaffing their coffee was the fact that everyone could see what I was doing, and I'm too much of a coward to risk getting caught. The malice to screw with someone's orders I totally possess. In short, I had to sell booze to a drunk man with a bad ID, and I quit. I was working at a part-time job at a local gas station chain a few months back to make some extra cash. Near the end of my shift on my third day, I had a very drunk man come up to the counter to buy 2 large cases of beer. I asked him for his ID and it was shredded, taped back together and outdated. He kept insisting he was a regular and it would be fine. I asked my trainee manager for help and she actually made me sell booze to this guy. I tried to protest, but she told me it would cost me my job if I didn't. I admit I made the sale, but I immediately went on break and called the GM and the person above them, and they refused to do anything. So I finished the remaining hour and quit. I've been asked to cook chickens that didn't smell too good. You know those recycle bins at supermarkets? The glass ones get rather dangerous when you're transporting usually 20 to 30 pounds of sharp, broken glass to the back of the truck to go to a plant. My former bosses expected me to do that myself in pouring rain or snow, where I had to lift the container practically over my head to dump in this bigger container. All for minimum wage. Screw that. As a doctor in the ICU, I have to continue treating a patient who is clearly dying and has no chance of survival because family members who know nothing about medicine get to make the decision and they don't want the person to die. So a person with no chance of survival is subjected to all sorts of invasive procedures, medications that will end up having no effect, in addition to the CPR, which is quite a violent procedure and will not save them, but it will break their ribs, among other things. I view this futile medical treatment as unethical. If someone can't survive, why am I pretending to save them by going through these motions, which is doing nothing to help? We were loading a truck late one night when one of us noticed a girl lying in a nearby parking lot, having some kind of seizure. It was already late, the parking lot was empty, and there was nobody else around other than us to go render some assistance. She might have laid there for hours if none of us had offered to help. Nevertheless, our boss told us to mind our own business and finish loading the truck. I said to myself, I'm not going to just ignore someone who could be dying, so I started towards the parking lot. But my boss began insisting that I was on his time and that I would do what he told me to do. I told him to take me off his time and continued over to the girl in the parking lot. It was a long time ago, and now that I remember, my boss did call 911 when we saw her lying there, so he wasn't exactly just going to leave her there. He just didn't want any of us going over and getting involved. We had a flood at a Ford dealership I worked at. The parts department was below ground and under about a foot of water. My boss asked me to gather older inventory that he couldn't send back and soak it down with a hose. His plan was to add it to the insurance claim. It was about $15K. I refused as it was blatant insurance fraud. He didn't push it. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.